Welcome to In the Shadows, I'm Jack. Here, you'll find scary stories to fall asleep. This is a black screen video with no ads, just you, the sound of rain, and horror lurking in the dark. Tonight, I'll guide you through tales of demons and the unknown. Relax, let the stories take you. If you're still with us, comment where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to know who's joining this show from the shadows. Don't forget to like and subscribe. No interruptions here, just more scary stories for you. Let's begin. You know how people say grief comes in waves? Well, they're lying. Grief doesn't come in waves, it lives in them. It's constant, but you just get better at dodging the bigger ones. I learned that after Lisa died, freak car accident. One of those things where you're watching TV one moment, and the next you're sitting in a hospital room, staring at a doctor who's saying all the right words, but nothing gets through. For a while after that, I just shut down, quit my job, cut off my friends. Our home, where we had our laughs, arguments, and all those ridiculous inside jokes, became this eerie, hollow place. Silence everywhere, except for the occasional creak of the floor or the hum of the refrigerator. Even the air seemed too still, as if the house knew Lisa wasn't coming back and didn't quite know how to react. The worst part, it was like time didn't exist anymore. Each day blurred into the next. I'd spend hours flipping through old photo albums or watching home videos on loop, just trying to keep her alive. Pathetic, maybe, but that's what grief does to you. Anyway, that's where I was one night, slumped on the couch with a bottle of cheap whiskey and the TV on mute when I heard a knock. At first, I thought maybe I was hearing things. I hadn't spoken to anyone in days, maybe longer, and there was something strange about a knock at night. I waited for whoever it was to leave, but then it came again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. So I got up, shuffled over to the door, and opened it. Now listen, I've never been the type to believe in weird stuff, and this'll sound ridiculous, but there was something off about this guy from the moment I saw him. He was old, like really old, but his eyes were sharp, bright, like he wasn't done living just yet. No umbrella, even though it had started raining pretty heavily. His clothes looked like they'd seen a lot of life. A long gray coat, buttoned up tight, and a hat that might have been stylish about 50 years ago. He just stood there, smiling at me like we were old friends. "Jason Merrick?" he asked, his voice calm, almost too calm for a guy standing in the rain. "Yeah," I replied, leaning against the door frame. I was already annoyed. I wasn't in the mood for whatever this was. "I'm Mr. Gravel. I heard about your wife. My condolences." Just what I needed. Some stranger from the neighborhood who heard through the grapevine. "Thanks," I muttered, trying to close the door. But this guy, he had a way of sticking around without forcing himself in. I don't know how to explain it, but I didn't shut the door on him. Not yet. "I'm not here to bother you long," Gravel said, as if reading my mind. "I run an antique shop just a couple of towns over. Deal in all sorts of curiosities." Great. Was this going to be some weird sales pitch? "Look, man, I'm not interested," I started, but then he cut me off with something I still wish I hadn't heard. "I've dealt in many strange artifacts over the years. Things most people would call impossible. But," he paused, leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing, "I know how much you've lost. And I know what it's like to want someone back. Desperately." I was about to shut the door right then and there. But the way he said that last part, there was something in his voice, like he knew what I'd been feeling. Hell, I never met the guy, but it was like he could see right through me. I didn't say anything, just stared at him, waiting for him to finish. "That's why I'm here, Jason. I have something that could bring her back. Not a memory, not a dream. Her? I swear," I almost laughed in his face. "Bring her back?" What was this guy, some snake oil salesman peddling miracles? But he didn't look like he was joking. No, this guy was dead serious. And for a second, just a second, the idea of it tugged at something deep inside me. "You don't have to believe me now," Gravel said, taking a step back, the rain picking up behind him. "But when you can't bear the pain anymore, seek me out. You'll find me. And I promise, the box will bring her back." I opened my mouth to ask what he meant by the box, but he turned and disappeared into the night before I could get a word out. I stood there for a minute, staring out into the rain, the sound of it tapping against the pavement, filling the space where Gravel had been. It was weird. The guy hadn't tried to push anything on me, no hard sell. But something about him stuck with me. Even as I closed the door, heading back to my couch and that bottle of whiskey, I couldn't shake the conversation. Now, maybe you're sitting there thinking, Jason, why didn't you just laugh it off? Some stranger shows up at your door, talks about bringing back the dead, and you entertain it. Trust me, I tried to brush it off. For the next few days, I kept telling myself it was just some crazy guy looking to make a buck off a grieving widower. But then the night started getting longer, darker. And the silence in the house? It got heavier. I didn't go looking for Gravel right away. But the idea that maybe, just maybe, he could do what he said, that stuck with me, gnawing at the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't pull out. And eventually, the pain of missing her outweighed the part of me that still had any common sense left. It didn't happen overnight, but it was inevitable, really. Grief does things to you, makes you think in ways that, if you were your normal self, you'd never consider. But I wasn't normal anymore. Not without Lisa. I held out for about 3 weeks after Mr. Gravel showed up. Spent my days staring at the same photos, rewatching the same wedding video, rewinding the moment she smiled at me on that dance floor over and over again. My nights? Well, they became these long stretches of emptiness where sleep wasn't even an option. I'd sit in the dark, nursing what was left of a whiskey bottle, wondering how the hell I was supposed to keep going without her. I wasn't. That was the answer. I wasn't supposed to keep going. Not without her. And that's when Gravel's words, "The box will bring her back," started to play on a loop in my head. I kept telling myself it was a load of crap. No way could someone just waltz in with some magic box and fix what was broken. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the idea. What if he wasn't lying? What if, by some stretch of the imagination, he was telling the truth? Eventually, I gave in. Judge me if you want, but you weren't there. You didn't feel that void every second of the day. The house didn't scream at you with its silence. And I swear to you, the night I finally made the decision, I wasn't drunk or delirious. I was just done. Done with living like this. So I went looking for Gravel. Now, I didn't have his address or a number to call, but part of me knew that if he wanted me to find him, I would. I drove to that neighboring town he'd mentioned, thinking it'd be like hunting down some run-down antique shop. I didn't even know where to start. Just drove around like an idiot for a while, stopping at random gas stations to ask if anyone had heard of Mr. Gravel's antiques. No one had, or at least no one said they had. I was about to give up when I spotted a narrow alley wedged between two brick buildings, almost invisible unless you were really looking for it. I don't know why, but something in my gut told me to turn down there. The rain had started up again, light at first, but steady enough to make everything glisten in the streetlights. The alley was dark, and at the end of it, I saw a small, old-fashioned shop window with a flickering neon sign that read, "Gravel's Curiosities." Bingo! I parked and walked through the rain, the wet pavement making my shoes squeak. The shop looked like something out of a different time, like it didn't quite belong to the rest of the world. There was no flashy storefront, just a dusty display with a few weird trinkets, an old clock, a porcelain doll missing an eye, some old books with cracked spines. Stuff you'd find in your grandmother's attic. I stepped inside, and the air smelled like mildew and old wood, like the place hadn't seen fresh air in years. Behind the counter, sorting through a stack of papers, was Gravel. He didn't look surprised to see me. "Jason," he said, looking up with that same eerie calm, "I was wondering when you'd come." Now, I'm not gonna lie, part of me thought about turning around and walking out. But I'd made it this far, hadn't I? I was there for a reason, so I stayed. "I need to know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "That thing you talked about? The box? Was it real? Can you actually bring someone back?" Gravel didn't answer right away. He just watched me, his eyes narrowed like he was sizing me up, seeing if I was really ready to go down this path. Finally, he nodded and motioned for me to follow him. He led me through the back of the shop, past shelves of strange artifacts, old brass instruments, cracked mirrors, things I couldn't even identify, and into a small room at the far end. In the center of the room, on a dusty wooden table, was a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was beautiful in its own eerie way, but it also gave me the creeps. Dark wood, polished to a strange gleam, covered in carvings that looked like symbols or maybe letters from some language I didn't recognize. Gravel stood next to the box, his hand resting lightly on top. "This," he said, "is what you came for." I stared at it, feeling both drawn to and repelled by the thing at the same time. "How does it work?" "It's simple," Gravel explained. "You place a personal item of the deceased inside, something meaningful, something connected to them. You close the box, and you leave it shut for 3 nights. On the 3rd night, they will return to you. But there's one thing you must understand." He looked at me, his voice dropping to a lower, almost grave tone. "They will come back hungry." I frowned. He nodded. "They will crave life, Jason. Energy, the essence that keeps us all moving, breathing, existing. They will need to feed on it, and they'll start with you." I wanted to ask him what the hell he meant by that, but my mind was stuck on one thing. 3 nights, and Lisa would be back. The details, the warning about hunger, felt like background noise at that point. I was too far gone to think rationally. "What do you mean, feed on me?" Gravel gave me a small, sad smile. "You'll see soon enough, but you can control it. You can give them what they need and still survive. You just have to be careful." Careful. Sure. Like any of this could ever be done carefully. I took a deep breath, weighing my options, which at this point felt like none. I wanted Lisa back, needed her back. Nothing else mattered. "So what do I need to do?" I asked. Gravel opened a drawer beneath the table and pulled out a small, delicate key. He handed it to me with a look that said more than his words ever could. "Take the box. Use the key to lock it once you've placed the item inside. And remember, you get one chance. Once you've done it, there's no undoing it." I nodded, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the box. It was heavier than it looked, the weight of it settling in my arms like something more than just wood. "One last thing," Gravel said as I turned to leave. "You'll have to give up something meaningful. To bring her back, you'll need to sacrifice a part of your life." I stopped, my hand on the door. "What do you mean?" He smiled that same unsettling smile. "You'll know when the time comes." Just with that, I left the shop, the rain pouring even harder now. The box cradled in my arms like it held the answer to everything. 3 nights. That's all it would take. And Lisa would be back. I drove home that night, with the box sitting on the passenger seat, staring at me like it knew exactly what I was about to do. I wasn't sure if it was the rain, which was coming down in sheets, or the fact that I'd just agreed to something insane, but my hands were white-knuckled on the wheel the entire drive. The air in the car felt thick, heavier than before, but I kept telling myself this was what I wanted, what I needed. It was the only way to fix everything. When I got home, the house was its usual dead quiet. I hated the way it felt now, like the walls were closing in, suffocating me. The last time it had been alive was when Lisa was here. And soon, she would be again. I took the box inside and set it on the coffee table. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong in this world. I paced around the living room trying to figure out what to use. Gravel had said I needed something personal, something meaningful, connected to Lisa. There were plenty of things, sure, but what would work? A piece of clothing? A book? What was meaningful enough to reach her, to bring her back from wherever the hell she was? My eyes landed on the jewelry box she kept on her nightstand, the wedding ring. I hadn't touched it since the day the hospital gave me back her personal effects. It was still there, tucked away, hidden because I couldn't bear to look at it, but now it felt like the only thing that made sense. I went upstairs, opened the drawer, and there it was, small, silver, with that tiny inscription on the inside. "Yours forever, Jay." I stared at it for what felt like hours, holding it between my fingers, remembering the way it looked on her hand, how she used to absent-mindedly twist it when she was thinking. I squeezed it so hard in my palm that it bit into my skin. This was it, the link that would bring her back. I took the ring and placed it inside the box. The click of the lid shutting sounded final, like the sealing of a tomb. I hesitated before locking it, Gravel's warning still ringing in my head. You'll get one chance. Once you've done it, there's no undoing it. But I was beyond reasoning with myself now. I'd crossed that line the second I walked into his shop. I turned the key in the lock. 3 nights. That's what he said. 3 nights, and she would come back to me. I wasn't sure what to expect after that. Some big sign? An earthquake? A flash of light? But nothing happened. The house stayed quiet, the rain still beat against the windows, and the box just sat there, lifeless. Part of me almost laughed at how ridiculous this all was. I was sitting in a dark house with a locked box, hoping my dead wife would walk through the door. It felt like a bad joke. But the longer I sat there, staring at the box, the more I started to feel something. It wasn't anything I could explain, but the air around it felt different, like the room wasn't as empty as it had been. I pushed the thought away and went upstairs to bed. That first night, nothing unusual happened. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with questions. What would Lisa be like when she came back? Would she be the same? Would she remember everything? And what had Gravel meant by hungry? None of it made any sense, but I was too far in to care. The need to see her, to have her back, drowned out any logical doubts. The second night, though, that's when things started to shift. I woke up around 2 a.m. for no particular reason. The house was completely still, but there was a feeling in the air. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I went downstairs to check the box, even though I knew it wouldn't open until the 3rd night. It was still there, locked and unmoving. But as I walked through the house, I had this unsettling sensation, like I wasn't alone, like someone was watching me. I chalked it up to nerves. Hell, I was bringing my wife back from the dead. Feeling a little freaked out wasn't exactly shocking. The 3rd night, though, that's when everything changed. I didn't go to bed that night. I couldn't. I stayed up, watching the clock like a madman, waiting for midnight. It was the longest night of my life, and by the time the clock hit 11:59, I could feel my pulse in my throat. When midnight finally came, I stood in front of the box, waiting for something, anything to happen. For a minute, nothing did, and then the lock on the box clicked. I didn't touch it. I didn't have to. The lid opened on its own, slowly, creaking like it was ancient, even though I knew I had just locked it 3 days ago. I stood there, frozen, staring into the box, empty. The ring was gone. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the empty space where it had been. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps upstairs, soft, deliberate, like someone was walking around. I stood there for a moment, not sure if I was imagining it. The house had been dead for so long, I wasn't used to hearing another person in it. But those footsteps, they were real. I knew them. I'd heard them 1,000 times before. Lisa. I ran upstairs, my breath catching in my throat as I reached the landing. The hallway light was dim, casting long shadows against the walls. The door to our bedroom was open, just a crack, and inside I could see a figure standing by the window. It was her. She was facing away from me, her back to the door, but I could see her silhouette. Same long hair, same slender frame. My heart jumped into my throat. She was here. She was really here. Lisa, I called, my voice shaking. She didn't turn around right away, but I could hear her breathing. It sounded strange, labored, almost like she was struggling with something. After a moment, she finally turned slowly, and I felt my knees go weak. It was Lisa, but something wasn't right. Her face, it was her face, but the skin looked too smooth, too perfect, like it had been stretched just a little too tightly over her bones. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, seemed off. They were too wide, too focused. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Jason," she whispered, her voice low and familiar but with an echo to it. "I'm back." For a moment, I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run to her, to hold her, to tell her how much I'd missed her. But there other part of me, the part that still remembered Gravel's warning, that kept me glued to the floor. "I'm so hungry," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper now. "Jason, I'm so hungry." It's hard to explain what it's like to stand in front of someone you love, someone you thought was lost forever, and feel nothing but fear. The woman in front of me looked like Lisa, almost, but the way she spoke, the way her eyes tracked me like she was sizing me up, it was wrong. Everything about her was wrong. And yet, there she was, breathing, moving, speaking. "I'm so hungry, Jason," she said again, that strange echo in her voice lingering in the air. She took a step toward me, slow and deliberate, her bare feet brushing against the hardwood floor. I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there, frozen, watching her come closer. The air between us felt thick, almost oppressive, like the room was holding its breath. What do you need?" I finally asked, my voice shaky. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for the briefest second I thought I saw something familiar, something that looked like the old Lisa. The Lisa I'd fallen in love with, the one who would spend rainy Sunday mornings curled up next to me with a book, or laugh at the most ridiculous things. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I need life," she whispered, her gaze sharpening. "Yours." That was the moment it hit me. Gravel's warning wasn't some cryptic metaphor. She wasn't hungry for food. She wasn't just back from the dead with a couple of screws loose. She needed life. She needed mine. She was too close now, just a few feet away, and I could feel the pull, the way the air seemed to vibrate with tension. I backed away, moving toward the door without even realizing it. "Lisa, wait," I said, my voice shaking. "What does that mean? What did they do to you?" Her lips curled into a strange smile. It wasn't her smile, not the one I remembered. "They didn't do anything, Jason. This is me. I'm just different now." She reached out, her hand brushing against my arm, and I felt it. A draining sensation, like she was pulling something out of me, something deep. It wasn't like feeling tired or weak. It was like the very essence of who I was being siphoned away, bit by bit. I jerked my arm back instinctively, stumbling a few steps away. "You can stop this," I said, my breath coming in quick bursts now. "We can figure this out. There has to be a way to—" She cut me off, taking another step forward, her eyes wide and hungry. "I can't stop it. I don't want to stop it, Jason. This is what I am now, and you're going to help me, whether you like it or not." I could hear the desperation in her voice, but there was no remorse, no guilt, just a cold, predatory hunger. I backed up again, this time turning toward the door. I had to get out. I had to think. This wasn't the Lisa I'd brought back. This wasn't the woman I'd loved. "You can't run," she said behind me, her voice calm and unnervingly soft. "I'll always find you. I'll always need you." That was enough to kick my brain into gear. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and running downstairs, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I was in the living room, breathing hard, trying to figure out what the hell to do next. The rain outside was hammering against the windows like it was trying to warn me, and then I heard her footsteps, slow, steady, deliberate. She wasn't running after me, but I knew she was coming. I had to think fast. I grabbed my phone, dialed Gravel's number, though to be honest, I wasn't even sure it would work. Would he answer? Would he help? Or was this just part of his twisted game? After 3 rings, he picked up. "Jason," he said, his voice calm as ever, like he knew exactly why I was calling. She's back," I stammered, pacing around the living room like a caged animal. "But something's wrong. She's not her. She's not Lisa. She is Lisa," Gravel replied, his tone matter of fact. "But she's also something else now. She needs life, Jason. You knew this." "I didn't know it would be like this," I shouted into the phone, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. She's trying to take my life." "She's hungry," he said calmly, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "That hunger is part of her now. But she doesn't have to take it all from you." "What the hell does that mean?" I asked, my voice rising with frustration. Gravel paused, as if considering how much to tell me. She can feed on others, he said slowly. If you give her someone else, someone full of life, it'll sate her. For a while, at least. I stood there, stunned, my heart racing as the meaning of his words sank in. You're telling me I have to sacrifice someone else to save myself? I asked, barely able to believe what I was hearing. Sacrifice, Gravel repeated, as if testing the word. It's not a pretty word, but it's accurate. If you want to survive, Jason, you'll have to make a choice. Her hunger will never stop. She'll keep taking from you until there's nothing left. But if you feed her someone else, well, she'll leave you alone. For a time, I could hear Lisa's footsteps getting closer. She was on the stairs now, her movements slow and deliberate. Who do I give her? I asked, my voice hollow. That's up to you, Gravel said, his voice cold. Someone close, someone you can bring to her without arousing suspicion. You need to make a decision soon, Jason. If you wait too long, she'll take everything from you, whether you want her to or not. And with that, he hung up, leaving me standing there, staring at the phone like it had just delivered my death sentence. I was out of options. Either I let Lisa drain me dry, or I did the unthinkable and found someone else for her to feed on. But who? How could I possibly live with myself after that? I heard her footsteps pause at the top of the stairs. Jason, she called, her voice soft but insistent. I'm still hungry. I looked around the room, my mind racing. There was no way out. She would come for me, and soon. That's when I remembered my neighbor, Tom. He lived alone. We weren't exactly close, but we'd talked enough times. He was friendly, maybe even trusting. And more importantly, he was nearby. I hated myself for even considering it, but Gravel's words echoed in my mind. She'll take everything from you. I had to choose. Before I could think too hard about it, I grabbed my coat and keys. Tom was only a few doors down. This would either save me or damn me forever. I wasn't sure which was worse. I left the house that night without looking back. The rain was coming down hard, the kind that feels like it's trying to wash the whole world clean. It hit my face in sharp, cold bursts as I jogged down the street, but I didn't care. My mind was already too twisted up to even notice the weather. All I could think about was what I was about to do. Tom was the perfect target. I hated myself for thinking of him that way, but it was the truth. He lived alone, he kept to himself, and he had no family in town, no one who'd notice if he didn't answer his phone for a few days. Hell, he'd probably even trust me if I knocked on his door in the middle of the night, saying I needed help. And that's exactly what I did. Tom's house was dark, save for a dim porch light that flickered every few seconds. I stood there, soaked to the bone, rehearsing what I was going to say in my head. It felt like my mind had split in two, one half screaming at me to stop this madness, to turn back before it was too late, and the other half calmly reminding me that if I didn't go through with this, Lisa would drain me dry by morning. I knocked on the door. 3 quick taps, same as Mr. Gravel had knocked on mine. For a moment, I thought maybe Tom wasn't home. Maybe fate was intervening, giving me a way out of this nightmare. But then the door creaked open, and there he was, standing in the dim light with a look of confusion on his face. "Jason?" Tom asked, blinking as if he couldn't quite process why I was there. "What the hell are you doing out in this weather?" I faked a smile, feeling like the worst kind of human being. "Hey Tom, I'm sorry to bother you so late. My power's out, and I was wondering if you could come take a look at the breaker box with me. I'm useless with that kind of stuff." It wasn't the best lie, but it was simple, and simple lies work best in desperate situations. Tom, being the good guy he was, nodded without hesitation. "Yeah, sure. Let me grab my jacket." As he disappeared inside, I stood on the porch, heart pounding in my chest. Part of me was screaming to turn around, to tell him it was a mistake, but I stayed rooted to the spot. If I didn't do this, Lisa would come for me. I'd felt it in her touch, that slow draining sensation, like my life was being sucked right out of my body. I wasn't going to survive another night with her hunger. Tom returned, pulling a raincoat over his head and grabbing a flashlight. "Let's go," he said, giving me a friendly slap on the shoulder as we headed back to my house. He had no idea he was walking into a nightmare. The walk back was quiet, aside from the rain pounding the pavement. Tom made a few comments about the storm, but I barely registered his words. My mind was focused on one thing, Lisa. When we got to the house, the air inside felt different. Heavier, like the house knew what was about to happen. I felt it the moment we stepped inside. Tom, on the other hand, was oblivious. "All right, where's this breaker box?" he asked, looking around the darkened living room. "Down in the basement," I said, forcing the words out. My voice sounded hollow in my own ears. "I'll show you." As I led him down the stairs, I could feel the tension mounting. Every step felt like I was walking deeper into some abyss I couldn't escape from. The basement was cold and dim, the perfect place for something terrible to happen. We reached the bottom, and Tom flicked on his flashlight, sweeping it over the walls. "Where's the box?" he asked, peering around. But before I could answer, Lisa stepped out of the shadows. "Jason," she whispered, her voice like silk sliding over broken glass. Tom spun around, his flashlight catching her face. He froze, staring at her like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Who's that?" he stammered, taking a step back. "Lisa," I said, my voice barely audible. "She's back." Tom turned to me, his face twisted in confusion. "What are you talking about? How?" Before he could finish, Lisa moved faster than I thought possible. She was on him in an instant, her hands grabbing his shoulders, pulling him close. Tom's eyes went wide with terror as she pressed her face to his, inhaling deeply, as if she were savoring the scent of his life. And then she began to feed. I'll never forget the sound. It wasn't a scream. It was more like a deep, guttural moan, a sound that seemed to come from the pit of his soul. Tom's body convulsed as Lisa drained him, pulling the life out of him in slow, agonizing waves. I stood there, frozen, watching it happen, too horrified to move, too desperate to stop it. This was what I'd asked for, wasn't it? I'd made the choice. In a matter of minutes, Tom was reduced to a hollow shell. His skin, once vibrant and alive, had turned a sickly gray. His eyes were glassy, lifeless. As Lisa gently laid him on the floor, her hunger sated for the moment. She turned to me, her face flushed with life. She looked more like herself now, more like the woman I remembered, but there was something darker in her eyes, something I couldn't ignore. "Thank you," she whispered, stepping toward me. "I feel so much better now." I backed away, my heart racing. What did you do to him?" "I took what I needed," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Just like I'll need to again, and again." That's when it hit me. This wasn't going to stop. I'd fed her once, but it wouldn't be enough. She'd need more. Always more. And if I didn't keep finding people for her, she'd turn on me. I could already feel the weight of her hunger hanging in the air between us. "What am I supposed to do now?" I asked, my voice breaking. Lisa smiled, that same eerie smile I'd seen the first night she returned. "You'll figure it out, Jason. You always do." I stood there, staring at her, the realization dawning on me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't love. This wasn't some twisted miracle where I got my wife back. This was a nightmare, and I was trapped in it. And the worst part, I'd done this to myself. Tom's body lay on the floor, a silent reminder of the price I'd already paid. And I knew, deep down, in a place I didn't want to admit existed, that I would have to do it again. And again. Lisa stepped closer, her voice a soft whisper in the darkness. "I'm hungry, Jason. Don't let me starve." And just like that, I understood. There was no going back. There was no escaping this. Lisa was back, but the cost was my soul. Or maybe in the end, it would be my life. Look, I'll be the first to admit it. This whole thing started because I was bored. Like stupidly bored. You know how it is when it's late at night and you're just scrolling through your phone because there's nothing better to do? Well, that's exactly where I was. It was one of those rainy nights where you're stuck inside and time just stretches on forever. The kind of rain that sounds nice at first, but starts feeling like it's never going to stop. I remember it was around 11 p.m., and I had work in the morning, but there I was, sitting in my crappy apartment, the rain tapping against my window like it was trying to remind me I had nowhere to go. So I'm just lying there, half awake, half asleep, doing the usual Instagram, Twitter, random YouTube videos. You know, the whole I should have been asleep an hour ago, but here I am routine. And that's when I came across this forum post. It was in some random tech subreddit about haunted technology or cursed apps. Don't judge me, I don't usually read that stuff, but like I said, I was bored out of my mind. People in the thread were talking about this app called The Gate. It wasn't on the App Store or anything, you had to sideload it, which probably should have been my first red flag. But I wasn't thinking about that. Everyone was saying it was this creepy thing no one could explain. You download it, it asks you what you want most, and then weird stuff starts happening. At first, I thought it was just another dumb internet urban legend, but the comments had this weird vibe. Some people claimed they'd deleted the app, but it just kept reinstalling itself. Others said they heard things, like actual voices, after downloading it. Part of me knew it was a bad idea, but the other part, the part that was scrolling through Reddit at midnight on a rainy Wednesday, yeah, that part thought, why not? What's the worst that could happen, right? So, I went for it. I found this shady link, downloaded the APK, and installed The Gate. The icon was this simple black square. No name, no logo, just black. When I opened it, there was this single line of text on the screen. What do you desire? That was it. No flashy graphics, no ads, just that. It was so simple, it actually made me laugh. I mean, who was I even supposed to be talking to? Some sketchy developer hiding in their mom's basement. But there I was, typing in the first thing that came to mind, a better life. I hit send, and nothing. For like 2 seconds, the app froze, and then my phone straight up shut off. Just went black. I tried turning it back on, but it wouldn't respond. At that point, I figured I'd just bricked my phone. Perfect. Exactly what I needed at midnight. After messing with it for a few minutes, I gave up, tossed it on my nightstand, and rolled over in bed. I remember thinking, well, that was a waste of time. But then, right as I started to doze off, I heard this weird hum, like a vibration, but not from my phone. I told myself it was the rain or maybe the pipes in the walls. This building wasn't exactly new, so stuff creaked all the time. But it was almost rhythmic, like someone was mumbling under their breath right next to me. I didn't check my phone again until the next morning. When I did, it was back on like nothing had happened. The weird part? The app was gone, completely. No trace of it, no icon, no files, nothing. It was like I'd imagined the whole thing, except I hadn't, because I remember the download process. I even had the random website bookmarked to prove it. Part of me was annoyed, but honestly, I didn't care enough to look into it more. I had work that day, and my phone wasn't fried, so I called it a win. But then something weird happened at work. I work at this tech repair shop. It's nothing fancy. Mostly cracked screens and water-damaged phones. But that day, customers were different. It's hard to explain. People were acting off, like irritated for no reason. And I wasn't doing myself any favors. I remember snapping at some guy because he was complaining about the wait time. I'm usually pretty chill, but that day, it was like every little thing got under my skin. I even got into it with my boss over something dumb, and I never argue with him. He's the kind of guy who will find a reason to dock your pay if you sneeze wrong, you know? I chalked it up to just having a bad day, but it wasn't just me. By the time I got home that night, the rain was still coming down, and I swear, the weirdest thing happened. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone again, when I heard that hum. Not the usual kind of hum, though. This time, it felt closer, like right next to me. I remember looking around the room, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but there was nothing. Just my empty, messy apartment, the rain outside, and that low, droning hum. I picked up my phone to check it, and as soon as I touched it, the screen lit up. Not with the normal lock screen, though. It was the gate. It had reappeared, Except this time, the question was different. The screen said, "Do you want more?" I didn't answer right away. Hell, part of me thought I was dreaming. But then I did what any idiot with too much time on their hands and not enough common sense would do. I typed yeah. Okay, so this is where things start to get, well, let's just say, weirder. After I typed yeah into the gate that second time, nothing really happened. The app didn't glitch out, my phone didn't die, nothing dramatic like that. Honestly, I kind of forgot about it. I think I just went to bed and figured I'd deal with whatever weirdness my phone was throwing at me later. The next morning felt normal enough. It had finally stopped raining, and I remember thinking it was about time. I grabbed a coffee from the place down the street, and everything felt fine until I got to work. Now let me be clear. My job isn't exactly a high-pressure situation. Like I said, it's just a small tech repair shop, mostly people with cracked screens or some water damage. But that day, the minute I walked in, I could tell something was off. People were looking at me. Like, really looking at me. At first I thought maybe I had something on my face or my shirt was inside out. You know, something dumb like that. But it wasn't just one or two people. It was everyone. Customers, my coworkers, even my boss. I walk over to my station, and Ryan, this guy I work with, just stares at me for a second before saying, "Dude, you good?" I shrugged. "Yeah, why?" He looks at me like I've just grown a second head or something. I don't know, man. You seem different today. I laughed it off because, honestly, what else was I supposed to do? But inside I was thinking, what the hell does that even mean? Different how? I didn't feel different. I felt fine. Better than fine, actually. For the first time in a long time, I felt confident. Like I wasn't just the guy fixing other people's broken stuff. I don't know how to explain it, but I liked it. Anyway, the day goes on, and the weird looks keep coming. Customers were acting strange, too. This one woman came in with a busted tablet, and I swear to you, she couldn't stop smiling at me. I'm not trying to sound cocky or anything, but it was like she was drawn to me. She was laughing at everything I said, even when I wasn't being funny. And it wasn't just her. Every customer who came in that day acted like I was some kind of tech wizard, like I could fix anything, and they were just lucky to be in my presence. It felt good. More than good, actually. It felt amazing. I know that sounds stupid, but when you're used to being invisible, suddenly having people notice you, yeah, it's addictive. But here's where things started to take a turn. Later that afternoon, my boss, Gary, who's usually a total hard-ass, calls me into his office. Now, normally when Gary calls you in, it's bad news. Like, you screwed up an order or you're taking too long on repairs, bad news. But this time, he's smiling at me. Like, genuinely smiling, which is terrifying if you've ever met the guy. He leans back in his chair and says, "Tom, you've been doing great work lately. I've been hearing a lot of good things from the customers. Keep it up, and there might be a promotion in your future." A promotion. Gary's never mentioned the word promotion to anyone ever. The guy's notorious for underpaying everyone and giving raises as often as solar eclipses. So yeah, I was shocked. But here's the thing, I didn't feel grateful or humble or any of that crap. I felt like, of course he was going to offer me a promotion. I deserved it. It was like my brain had flipped a switch, and suddenly I just knew I was better than everyone else there. I can't explain it. I mean, I've never been that guy, the cocky, full of himself jerk, but suddenly that's exactly what I felt like. So I smiled back at Gary, told him I appreciated it, and walked out of his office feeling like I owned the place. That night, things escalated. After work, I went out to this bar downtown. I wasn't planning on it, but I guess I just felt like I needed to celebrate something. I don't know, maybe that promotion talk had gone to my head. Anyway, I'm sitting at the bar, minding my own business, when this guy next to me starts chatting. He's one of those overly friendly types, you know? The kind of guy who thinks every stranger wants to be his best friend. Normally, I would have just nodded along, maybe thrown in a polite smile and waited for him to get bored and leave. But this time, I don't know what came over me, but I decided to play along. We ended up talking for a while. and I could tell the guy was hanging on every word I said. Like, genuinely fascinated by everything I was saying, even the dumb stuff. The more we talked, the more I felt like I had this power over him. Over everyone in the bar, really. It wasn't just the guy next to me. I caught people glancing over at me, whispering to each other, like I was someone important. I'm not saying I was the most interesting person in the room, but it felt that way. At some point, the guy asked me what I did for work, and I don't know why, but instead of telling him about the tech shop, I made up some ridiculous story about being an entrepreneur. And he starts asking me for advice, like I'm some business genius, and I'm just sitting there, feeding him more bullshit. It was so easy, and I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. The lies just kept flowing, and he kept eating them up. Then, out of nowhere, the app flashed into my mind. I hadn't thought about the gate since that morning, but suddenly it was like I could feel it. I don't know, watching me, or maybe guiding me. It's hard to explain. All I knew was that everything that had happened that day, the looks, the attention, the confidence, it was all connected to that stupid app. By the time I left the bar, it was pouring again. I walked home in the rain, not caring that I was soaked through. I had this weird buzz going, like I was untouchable. But when I got home and looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, but because of the way I felt different. I went to bed that night thinking everything was fine. Better than fine, actually. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. And that's when the whispers started. Alright, so here's where everything started going sideways. At first, I tried to brush it off. The whispers, the way people were acting around me, but it got harder and harder to ignore. I mean, at what point do you stop pretending everything's normal when clearly it's not? The whispers weren't loud, but they were constant. It was like someone was talking just out of earshot, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make out what they were saying. But the worst part, it was always coming from my phone. I swear, every time I picked it up, I could hear that low murmur, like some kind of background noise I couldn't shake. I kept telling myself it was just in my head. Maybe I was working too much. Maybe I needed a break. But the thing is, it wasn't just the whispers. People around me were changing. Or maybe I was changing, and they were just reacting to it. I don't know. Either way, things got weird fast. Take work, for example. After that little chat with Gary about the promotion, I started getting more responsibility. At first I thought, hey, this is good. This is what I wanted, right? But the more I got, the more I realized it wasn't just Gary giving me extra shifts or bigger projects. It was like he was scared of me. Not in an obvious way, he wasn't shaking in his boots or anything, but there was this hesitation in his voice whenever he talked to me, like he didn't want to upset me. I figured it was just because I was stepping up, doing better work, but the way he looked at me, that wasn't normal. And he wasn't the only one. Ryan, the guy who asked me if I was good the other day, he started avoiding me. At first, it was subtle. He'd suddenly be busy when I came over to his station, or he'd act like he hadn't seen me when we passed each other in the break room. But after a while, it got more obvious. He'd keep his head down, barely say a word to me. It was like he didn't want to get too close. I'll admit, part of me kind of liked it. There was this strange satisfaction in knowing I had this effect on people. I mean, who wouldn't want to feel like they're finally being taken seriously? But at the same time, it freaked me out. I wasn't used to people being scared of me, and honestly, I didn't know what I was doing to make them feel that way. Then the blackout happened. It was about a week after I downloaded the gate, maybe a little longer, I'm not sure anymore. The days started to blur together after a while. I was at work, everything was going smoothly, and then nothing. 1 minute, I'm repairing this guy's iPad, and the next, I'm waking up in the back alley behind the shop with no idea how I got there. I didn't pass out. At least, I don't think I did. It wasn't like I felt dizzy or sick. I just blinked, and suddenly, I was somewhere else. My hands were covered in dirt, my shirt was torn, and my phone, Well, let's just say it wasn't in my pocket anymore. I found it lying on the ground a few feet away. The screen cracked like it had been thrown. I picked it up, and there it was again. The gate. The app was back, staring at me from the screen like it had been waiting for me. Except this time, the message was different. It didn't ask what I desired. It didn't ask for anything, actually. It just said, "I'm here." I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that message, but it felt like forever. Part of me wanted to throw the phone, smash it to pieces, and be done with it. But another part, the part that had been growing louder in my head since I downloaded the damn thing, wanted to open it, to see what was behind the door. I didn't, though. Instead, I stuffed the phone in my pocket and went back inside like nothing had happened. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself I was just tired, maybe working too many late nights. But the more I tried to push it away, the louder the whispers got. And they weren't just coming from my phone anymore. It was like they were everywhere. In the shop, in the street, even in my apartment when I got home that night. They followed me. The next day I noticed something else. People were starting to act weird around me, but not in the same way as before. It wasn't just the looks or the avoidance. Now, they were going out of their way to avoid me, like crossing the street or turning the other way when they saw me coming. Even the regular customers, people I'd been fixing phones for months, stopped coming in. And the few who did, they wouldn't make eye contact. They'd mumble something about how they heard things or that maybe it wasn't a good time to be in the shop. I tried to ask Ryan what was going on, but he wouldn't even look at me. He just shook his head and said, "You need help, man." Seriously, I remember laughing it off like it was a joke. But inside, I wasn't laughing. Inside, I was starting to lose it. I didn't know what was real anymore. Was it me? Was it the app? Was I imagining all of this? That night, I opened the gate again. I don't know why. Maybe I was desperate for answers. Maybe I just wanted it to stop. But when I opened it, the screen was blank. No message, no prompt, just that same black square. And then, slowly, a new message appeared. "Let me in." I stared at it for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me knew exactly what it meant. It wasn't asking for permission. It was a command. Whatever was behind that app, whatever had been whispering to me, it wanted more. It wasn't enough to mess with my phone or make people act weird. It wanted me. I didn't respond. I locked the phone, shoved it in a drawer, and tried to forget about it. But that night, I heard the whispers louder than ever. Except now, they weren't just whispers. They were voices. Voices calling my name, telling me to open the door, telling me to let it in. And I was scared. At this point, I was barely holding it together. Every second, it felt like something was clawing at my brain, telling me to open the gate again. The whispers, the voices, whatever it was getting louder, clearer, and I was running out of ways to ignore it. But I knew one thing for sure. I needed help. Real help. The first person I thought of was Ryan. I know, it doesn't make a lot of sense given how weird things had been between us, but I didn't have anyone else. We weren't best friends or anything, but we spent enough time together at work that he was the closest thing I had to a confidant. Plus, he knew tech. If anyone could help me figure out what the hell was going on with that app, it was him. So, after another sleepless night of pacing around my apartment, listening to those voices, I cornered him at work the next morning. "Hey man," I started, keeping my voice low. "I need to talk to you about something. It's serious." Ryan glanced up at me, then quickly looked away like he didn't want to get sucked into whatever I was about to unload on him. I could tell he was still freaked out by whatever vibe I'd been giving off lately, but he didn't try to walk away. Small victory, I guess. "Look, I know I've been acting weird," I said, "and I'm probably about to sound even weirder, but I need your help." He didn't say anything, just kept fiddling with some busted phone on his workbench. But I could tell he was listening. "There's this app," I continued, feeling like a complete idiot. "It's called The Gate. I downloaded it a few weeks ago, and ever since, things have been happening, like really messed up things. I think it's, I don't know, cursed or something. That got his attention. He stopped what he was doing and finally looked at me, one eyebrow raised. Cursed? He repeated like he was trying not to laugh. Yeah, I know how it sounds, I said, holding up my hands. But I swear, I'm not making this up. Every time I open the app, weird stuff happens. People act different around me, and it's like I'm not in control anymore. And the voices, there's this whispering that won't stop. Ryan stared at me for a few seconds, then put down the phone he was working on and rubbed his eyes like he was trying to process what I just said. Dude, he finally said, his voice low. I don't know what's going on with you, but that sounds insane. I know, I admitted, feeling like I was about to lose whatever tiny grip I still had on him. But I need you to trust me. I'm not making this up. I'm not, I don't know, hallucinating or whatever. This app is real, and it's doing something to me. He let out a slow breath and nodded, though I could tell he wasn't totally convinced. Still, he said, all right, show me. We waited until our lunch break, then we sat in the back of the shop, hunched over my phone. I unlocked it, my hands sweating, and opened the drawer where I'd shoved it the night before. There it was. The gate, still on my screen, still waiting. Ryan leaned over my shoulder as I pulled it up. The black square stared back at us, unblinking. That's it? He asked, frowning. Doesn't look like much. It doesn't look like anything, I said. But trust me, it's more than it seems. Every time I interact with it, something happens. Watch. I tapped the screen, expecting the usual prompt to show up. What do you desire? Or let me in. But instead, the app glitched for a second. Just static, like an old TV that couldn't find a signal. Then it cleared up, and a new message appeared. Too late. Ryan jumped back, almost knocking over the stool behind him. What the hell? I didn't know what to say. I mean, I wasn't expecting that either. I just stared at the screen, my brain trying to catch up. Too late for what? What was it talking about? Ryan was clearly freaked out, but he wasn't the type to just bail without trying to figure things out. Okay, that was weird, he said, his voice shaky. But it could just be a glitch. Let me see the code. He took my phone, connected it to his laptop, and started digging through the files. After a few minutes, he frowned. Man, this is some seriously messed up coding, he muttered. It's like nothing I've ever seen before. It's encrypted to hell and back, and it looks like there are parts of the app that aren't even on your phone. It's running from some remote server, but I can't trace where it's coming from. Can you delete it? I asked, trying to stay calm. Ryan shook his head. Not in the usual way. It's embedded deep. I can't even find the original download source. It's like it's hiding. Great, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. So now what? Ryan sighed and leaned back in his chair. I think this thing is more than just an app, Tom. I don't know, but it's bad. Really bad. You need to get rid of it, but I don't know how. Just as he said that, the lights in the back room flickered. We both looked up, then at each other. It wasn't just the lights. The air felt heavier. Like something was in the room with us, watching. Did you feel that? Ryan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, I said. I didn't want to admit how much it was freaking me out. And then we heard it. The whispering. Not from my phone this time, but from the room itself. Low, guttural voices, speaking words I couldn't understand. But I knew what they were saying. I knew they were coming for me. Suddenly, the back door to the shop slammed open, and in the doorway there was a figure. A shadow, really. Tall, broad shoulders, no real features, just a shape. A dark, looming presence that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. It was him, the stranger, the one I'd seen watching me in the bar and the streets everywhere. Only now he was right here, and there was no running away from him. Ryan bolted from his chair, but the figure didn't move. He just stood there, watching us, like he was waiting for something. I wanted to run too, but I was frozen in place. Then, without a word, the stranger stepped forward. I've let him in, I whispered. I swear, in that moment, everything stopped. The stranger, this dark, hulking figure standing in the doorway, just kept moving toward us, slow and steady, like he had all the time in the world. I could feel the room getting colder, like all the heat was being sucked out, leaving nothing but this creeping, bone-deep chill. Ryan was the first to react. He grabbed a wrench off the workbench, like that was going to do anything, and backed up until he was pressed against the wall, his eyes wide. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice cracking. But I couldn't answer him. I knew exactly what it was, but I didn't want to say it, didn't want to admit that all of this, the app, the voices, the weird things happening, had led to this. To him, the stranger was the demon, or at least his avatar, his presence in the real world, and I was the one who'd let him in. He kept coming closer, and as he did, the voices started up again, louder this time, but clearer too. I could hear what they were saying now. "Tom, you know what you have to do." Ryan was panicking, looking at me like I had all the answers. "Dude, what's going on? What's happening right now?" I swallowed, my throat dry as sandpaper. "It's him," I said, barely able to get the words out. "It's the thing from the app. I think it's here for me." Ryan's face paled, and I could tell he didn't want to believe me. But what else could he do? The proof was literally standing in front of us, moving closer with each second. His breaths were coming in short, sharp bursts, and I could see his hands shaking, even though he was gripping that wrench like his life depended on it. Maybe it did. The stranger stopped just a few feet away from me, standing perfectly still, his face still hidden in shadow. And then he spoke. But it wasn't his voice, exactly. It was like 100 voices, all layered over each other, speaking in unison. "Tom," he said, his voice making the whole room vibrate. "The gate is open. The time has come. You know what must be done." My heart, or whatever was left of it, felt like it was sinking into a pit of darkness. I didn't know exactly what he meant, but I could feel it. This wasn't just about me anymore. This thing wanted to fully cross over. He wanted to be here in the world, and he needed me to make that happen. I was the key. Ryan looked between me and the stranger, like he was trying to piece it together. "Tom, we need to get out of here. Now." I didn't move. I couldn't. I was too far in, too deep. The voices were pulling me in 1,000 directions, and no matter what I did, I knew I couldn't just walk away. Not without paying the price. Then, as if he could hear my thoughts, the stranger spoke again. "One sacrifice. That is the cost. One life to seal the bond." Sacrifice. That word hit me like a punch in the gut. I knew what he meant, and it wasn't something I could run from anymore. Either I gave him what he wanted, or he'd take it from me. Ryan stepped forward, grabbing my arm and shaking me hard. "Tom, snap out of it. We need to go." I looked at him, and for the first time in days, everything seemed clear. The fog lifted, the voices quieted, and I could see the choices laid out in front of me. There were only two. I could let the stranger in fully, let him take control, let him have the world, or I could stop it. But stopping it meant I had to give him something. Someone. And that someone could only be one person. I glanced at Ryan, my stomach twisting with guilt. He was my friend, maybe the only real friend I had left, and he was standing there, ready to fight for me, to help me get out of this. He had no idea what I was about to do. One sacrifice. The stranger's voice echoed in my head, louder now, pushing me, forcing me to make the choice. "Ryan," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry." He frowned, confused. What? What are you talking about?" Before I could stop myself, I grabbed the wrench from his hand. He tried to pull back, but I was faster. Stronger. I don't know where the strength came from. Maybe it was the stranger's influence, or maybe I'd just been pushed too far, but in one quick motion, I swung the wrench at Ryan's head. The crack of metal hitting bone was deafening. He didn't even have time to scream. His body hit the ground with a sickening thud, blood pooling beneath him as his eyes stared up at me, wide with shock. I stood over him, frozen, the wrench still clutched in my hand, my brain trying to process what I'd just done. The stranger smiled, or at least, I think he did. It was hard to tell with his face hidden in shadow, but I could feel his satisfaction. The air around us seemed to shift, like the room itself had been holding its breath and was finally exhaling. The voices quieted, the tension eased, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of peace. I'd done it. I'd given him what he wanted. But the peace didn't last long. As I stood there, staring at Ryan's lifeless body, the stranger began to change. His shape shifted, growing larger, darker, until he wasn't just a figure in the doorway anymore. He was everywhere. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they all seemed to melt into shadow, consumed by the stranger's presence. And then I realized the truth. It wasn't just one life, it was my life, too. The stranger wasn't here to let me live out some twisted version of success. He wasn't going to make me powerful or give me everything I wanted. He was here to take it all. To take me. I was the final piece of the puzzle, the last part of the sacrifice. I'd been the gatekeeper all along. As the darkness closed in around me, swallowing the world whole, I could hear the stranger's voice, soft and cold, whispering in my ear. You were always mine. And then, there was nothing. Look, I'm not your typical good guy, all right? I'm not out there rescuing animals or helping little old ladies across the street. But that night, everything changed. It was raining. Not just the annoying drizzle you can ignore, but the kind of rain that pounds against your window like it's trying to get inside. I was tired, soaked to the bone, and just wanted to get home. But then I saw it. There, huddled under the awning of the bodega on the corner, was this tiny black kitten. Barely more than a handful of fur and bone. It wasn't even meowing, just sitting there like it had given up. Part of me thought, walk on, Jake. This isn't your problem. But judge me if you want. I felt sorry for the little thing. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe I was in a weird mood. I don't know. I crouched down and said something dumb like, "Hey buddy, you alright?" Like the thing was gonna answer me. I picked it up, and that's when I noticed something strange. Its fur wasn't just black. It was like this deep, inky void. Almost shimmered under the streetlight. Weird, right? But I didn't think too much of it at the time. I tucked the kitten into my jacket, figuring I'd take it home, give it some food, and maybe drop it off at a shelter the next day. Now here's the thing. From the second that cat entered my house, stuff got weird. Not like the usual new pet chaos, but weird. The first night, the lights flickered. Yeah, I know, sounds cliche, but I figured I needed to call an electrician. Old building, faulty wiring, nothing new. Then my alarm clock started resetting itself. Middle of the night, every night. 3:30 a.m. exactly. Again, I know I'm not jumping to conclusions here. Probably some power surge, right? But that kitten, I'd named him Shadow, was always watching. It's hard to explain. You know how pets look at you like they're trying to understand you? It wasn't like that. Shadow didn't blink. He'd just sit there, staring. And it wasn't like he was waiting for food or attention. He just watched. Like he knew something I didn't. A couple of weeks passed, and that's when I noticed things getting out of hand, mainly with me. I've always been a pretty chill guy, but lately, everything pissed me off. Some dude cuts me off in traffic, and I'm shouting out the window like a lunatic. At work, I snapped at my boss, nearly threw a wrench at the guy. He's a jerk, but still, that's not me. The worst part, I didn't even feel bad about it. In fact, I felt, I don't know, justified, like they deserved it. And at home, Shadow would be there, perched on the windowsill or curled up in a corner, just watching like he approved. Then there was Mrs. Fleming. My next-door neighbor, she'd lived there for, I don't know, decades. Nice enough lady, but a bit of a busybody. Always complaining about something. Your lawn's a mess, Jacob. Are you going to paint that fence? You get the idea. One day she came over in the middle of the rain, banging on my door about the state of my gutters. I opened the door, dripping wet, and there she was, just going on. And suddenly I had this urge. This wild thought crossed my mind, out of nowhere, telling me I could just end it. Just shut her up for good. She was old, fragile. It'd be easy, quick, she wouldn't see it coming. I stood there, gripping the edge of the door, knuckles white. Shadow was by my feet, purring softly. I swear, it was like the cat was whispering in my ear, telling me, "You're doing the right thing. You're almost there." But then something in me snapped. I backed away, shaking my head like I'd just woken up from a bad dream. Mrs. Fleming stared at me like I'd lost my mind. I probably looked like I had. She muttered something about calling the cops if I didn't fix my gutters, and off she went, her umbrella wobbling as she shuffled back through the rain. I closed the door and just stood there, staring at Shadow. He blinked at me, all innocent-like, but I knew better. There was nothing innocent about that cat. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mrs. Fleming at the bottom of her stairs, twisted and broken. And in every vision, I wasn't just standing there. I was smiling. I woke up the next morning feeling like I hadn't slept at all, which wasn't too far from the truth. I'd maybe caught a couple of hours here and there, but most of the night, I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying not to think about Mrs. Fleming, or that urge I'd had. But when I finally dragged myself out of bed, there was Shadow, sitting at the foot of the bed, like always. He stared at me, eyes half closed, purring softly like everything was normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. Work wasn't any better. I could tell people were starting to talk. I used to joke around with the guys on site, have a few laughs during lunch. But lately, it was like I couldn't stand to be around anyone. Everything about them annoyed me. Their voices, their faces, the way Pete from accounting always chewed with his mouth open. The way my boss, Rick, had that smug look whenever he gave orders like he thought he was some kind of big shot. By the end of the day, I was ready to punch something, or someone. And then on my way home, I saw Tony's name pop up on my phone. My brother Tony. Always the concerned one, always checking in on me like I was a kid. Usually, I didn't mind. We were close enough, but that day, I almost threw the phone out the window. I let it ring out. I wasn't in the mood for a lecture. When I got home, it was raining again. Of course it was. It felt like it hadn't stopped since the night I found Shadow. I stepped inside, shook off my jacket, and there he was, waiting for me, curled up on the couch like he owned the place. His eyes followed me as I moved through the room, watching every step I took. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and collapsed into the armchair, trying to relax. But I couldn't shake this feeling. This growing, gnawing frustration that was bubbling up inside me. Every little thing was setting me off. And then my phone buzzed again. It was Tony, texting this time. "Hey, you good? Haven't heard from you in a while. Call me." I stared at the message for what felt like forever. Part of me knew I should call him back just to get him off my back. But the other part of me, the part that had been getting louder lately, was just pissed that he wouldn't leave me alone. "You don't need him," a voice whispered. "He doesn't understand." I sat up straight, the beer can slipping from my hand and hitting the floor. I looked around, but of course, there was no one else there. Just me and Shadow. Shadow, who was now sitting up, watching me, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. His purring had stopped. That voice, though, I could still hear it, faint but clear, like it had come from inside my head. I stood up, running a hand through my hair, pacing the room. This was crazy. I was going crazy. People don't hear voices. That's not a thing that happens. But the voice came again, low and calm, like it had always been there. "You don't need anyone. They'll only hold you back." I stopped pacing and stared at Shadow. He stared back, his tail flicking slowly. There was something about the way he was looking at me, something that made my skin crawl. But more than that, it made me angry. Angry in a way that didn't make sense. Like all the irritation, all the frustration I'd been feeling these past few weeks had been building up, and now it was ready to burst out of me, and I had no idea why. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling, and dialed Tony's number before I could stop myself. He picked up on the second ring. "Jake? Hey man, I've been trying to reach you. Everything okay?" His voice, calm, concerned, made me want to scream, but I swallowed it down. "Yeah, I'm fine," I muttered, though it came out more aggressive than I intended. "Just been busy." There was a pause on the other end. "Busy doing what? You don't sound fine, Jake. I'm worried about you." I clenched my jaw. "Well, don't be." Another pause. Longer this time? Then look, maybe I should come by. We can talk, grab a beer, whatever. No. It came out harsher than I meant it to, and I winced as soon as I said it. But it was too late. The damage was done. I could hear Tony shift on the other end of the line. Jake, what's going on? You're not acting like yourself. Is this about the cat? I know you're not really a pet guy, and it's not the cat. I snapped, and before I could stop myself, I added, and I don't need you coming over here trying to fix things. I'm fine. Silence. Then Tony sighed. All right, man, if you say so, but I'm here if you need me. Just don't shut me out, okay? I hung up without saying goodbye. Shadow leapt onto my lap, his claws digging into my jeans. He looked up at me, his black fur shining even in the dim light, and I swear, for just a second, I saw something in those eyes. Something that didn't belong in any normal cat. You did the right thing, the voice whispered again. And this time I didn't argue. It wasn't long after the call with Tony that things really started to spiral. The day after Mrs. Fleming's little visit, word got around the neighborhood that she'd had a fall. A bad one. Broke her hip, or at least that's what people were saying. It sounded serious enough that she'd been taken to the hospital. Now, part of me, no, most of me, should have been concerned. I should have been that guy who immediately thought, damn, I hope she's okay. But that's not what I thought, not even close. Instead, I felt this strange relief, like a weight had been lifted. She wouldn't be coming around anymore, nagging about my lawn or the gutters. I didn't have to deal with her. And, yeah, I knew how screwed up that sounded, but it was the truth. I told myself it was just because I was under a lot of stress. Work had been crazy, I was on edge, and things were just getting to me more than usual. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. Then, a few days later, Tony showed up at my place. No warning, no heads up, just knocked on my door like everything was normal. I opened the door, and there he was, standing in the rain, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, looking at me like I was some kind of charity case. Hey, he said, stepping inside before I could tell him I wasn't in the mood. You didn't pick up my calls, so I figured I'd swing by. I wasn't sure if I was angry or relieved to see him. He was my brother, sure, but lately, he felt more like a babysitter, hovering, waiting for me to screw up. He glanced around the living room, his eyes landing on Shadow, who was curled up on the couch, watching like he always did. That the famous cat? Tony asked, his tone light, but there was something behind it. Concern, maybe, or suspicion? I couldn't tell anymore. Yeah, that's him, I muttered, shutting the door harder than I needed to. Look, I'm fine, Tony. You didn't have to come all the way over here. Tony didn't say anything for a second. He just kept staring at Shadow, who, as usual, was staring right back. Jake, something's wrong. I can feel it. Ever since you got that cat, you've been different. I mean, I get it, life's stressful, but this isn't you. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. I didn't want to hear this. Not from Tony. Not from anyone. I wasn't different. People were just idiots, that was all. They were the ones changing, not me. But the way Tony was looking at me, like he already had me figured out, it pissed me off. I'm telling you, I'm fine, I snapped. It's just a cat, Tony. You're acting like it's some kind of demon. Tony's eyebrows shot up. A demon? I didn't say anything about demons, man. But now that you mention it, he was trying to make a joke, lighten the mood. But I wasn't laughing. Just drop it, I said, my voice cold. I don't need you to psychoanalyze me. But Tony being Tony, he didn't drop it. Jake, I'm serious. Something's off, and I think it has to do with that damn cat. Shadow's tail flicked as Tony said it, as if the cat understood the conversation. It was weird, but I brushed it off. My brother was always the superstitious one, the type who'd seen The Exorcist one too many times. But then Tony took it a step further. I talked to someone, he said, his voice low like he was about to tell me something secret. A priest, he said. I burst out laughing. I couldn't help it. It was one of those laughs that you know shouldn't come out, but once it starts, it's not stopping. A priest? You've got to be kidding me, Tony. You called a priest because I've got a cat? I'm serious, Jake, Tony said, his expression dead sober. This isn't normal. That cat. It's doing something to you. I can feel it. The priest agreed to come by just to... No, I interrupted, my voice harder than I meant. I'm not letting some guy in a collar walk into my house and tell me I'm possessed or whatever you're thinking. Tony looked like he was about to argue, but something stopped him. Shadow had gotten up, slinking across the couch, moving closer to me. His fur brushed against my leg, and I swear to you, it felt different. He was warm, sure, but there was this odd static to it, like the air around him was charged. Like there was something else inside that tiny body. I shot a look at Tony, ready to tell him to get out of my house. But then the voice came again, soft, like a thought sneaking in under the radar. He doesn't understand. You don't need him. I blinked, my head swimming for a second. I wanted to push Tony out, make him leave me alone. But something in me, something small, buried deep, knew he was right. It wasn't the cat, not exactly. It was what Shadow was. He's trying to control you, Jake, Tony pressed. Let the priest come by just to... No, I said again, this time more forceful. I could feel Shadow rubbing against my leg, and the static buzz was getting stronger. Tony, I don't need help. You're the one who doesn't understand. Tony took a step back, clearly shaken by my tone. All right, I'll back off, but if you ever need... I won't, I cut him off. And as Tony left, closing the door behind him, I felt something settle in the air. The house was quiet again. Peaceful. I looked down at Shadow, who was now sitting at my feet, looking up at me with those deep, inky eyes. He blinked once, slow, like he was satisfied. And the voice in my head whispered once more, "You did the right thing." You ever had one of those moments where you're looking back and you think to yourself, how the hell did I miss that? I mean, I should have known something was off the minute I walked into Willowbrook High that first day. It wasn't just that the place had changed, more than I thought a school could in the years I'd been gone. No, there was something else. Something lurking under the surface, waiting to be noticed. But, like an idiot, I chalked it all up to small-town weirdness. Anyway, it was pouring rain when I showed up, which is just my kind of luck. You'd think starting fresh would come with a bit of sunshine, but no. Rain. It was one of those cold, relentless showers that just soaks you through, no matter what you're wearing. I had my umbrella, but by the time I walked from my car to the front entrance, my shoes were squelching. My jacket might as well have been a sponge, and I was already regretting every life choice that brought me back to Willowbrook. The school hadn't changed much on the outside, though. Same brick building, same weird gothic vibe, like it was trying way too hard to look intimidating. When I was a kid, we all thought it was cool, like something out of a horror movie. Now, standing there, soaked to the bone, I just wanted to get inside and warm up. Inside, though, that's where the changes hit. The lighting was dimmer, for starters. Not the kind of dim where you think, oh, someone needs to change a few bulbs, but more like the place just felt darker. I tried not to think about it too much. After all, I hadn't been back in years, and maybe my memory was playing tricks on me. Or maybe it was the rain, who knows. The principal, Mrs. Garber, was waiting for me by the office, just like she said she would be when we talked over the phone. Now, you ever meet someone and immediately get the sense that they're not to be messed with? That was her. She had this sharp, no-nonsense look, like one of those old-school headmistresses from the books I used to teach. Except she wasn't yelling at kids about their homework. She was giving me the kind of smile that said, "Welcome back, but don't get comfortable." "Mr. Marshall," she said, her voice cool and polite. "Welcome back to Willowbrook." I did my best to return the smile. "Thanks. It's, good to be back." A lie, but hey, I wasn't about to tell her that. I was too busy trying to figure out why I suddenly felt like a kid again, standing there, soaked and slightly intimidated. She gave me the quick tour, all the usual spots, and I'll admit at first nothing seemed that strange. The place smelled like every other high school I'd ever taught in. floor cleaner, stale coffee, and that faint teenage musk that no janitor on earth can ever fully get rid of. But as we walked down the halls, I couldn't shake this nagging feeling. The students, well, they weren't bad, but they were quiet. Too quiet. Everyone was doing exactly what they were supposed to, like they were on autopilot. And look, I've taught at a lot of schools, okay? Kids don't behave like that. Not naturally. There's always at least one or two goofing off, passing notes, looking like they're seconds away from starting a spitball war. But here, nothing. Just heads down, eyes on the front, and not a peep out of anyone. I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I pushed the thought aside. It was my first day back after all. Maybe I just wasn't used to small-town kids anymore. I got to my classroom, and it looked normal enough. Desks, chairs, whiteboard. Same setup I'd had in the city, only the windows were bigger, and the rain was still coming down in sheets outside. I was going through the motions trying to get settled, when this girl, Emily, walks up to me at the end of the day. Quiet, maybe 15 or 16, but there was something about her that caught my attention. She looked scared, isn't the right word. More like she was holding on to a secret that was about to explode. She hands me a piece of paper, doesn't say a word, and just bolts out of the room before I can ask her what's up. Now, this is the part where you're supposed to shrug and say, "Kids, right?" But something about the way she took off bugged me. So I unfold the note, thinking it's probably some kind of prank. It wasn't. The note read, "Help us. Don't trust them." At first, I laughed. Seriously, I laughed. Part of me thought it was just a typical teenage stunt, like those notes you find that say, "Get out while you still can." But a bigger part of me, well, I don't know. Something about it got under my skin. I tried to shake it off, but as I walked out of the building that evening, still raining, I ran into Mr. Cole, the janitor. Now, Mr. Cole had been around when I was a kid, and the guy had barely aged a day. He looked at me like I was walking into a trap, but he didn't say anything, just mumbled something under his breath. I couldn't make it out, but it didn't matter. His expression said more than words ever could. I thought about that note all night. Emily's face kept popping into my head, and no matter how much I told myself to let it go, I couldn't. Something was wrong at Willowbrook High, and even though I didn't have any proof, I knew I wasn't going to ignore it. Looking back, I wish I had. I wish I'd crumpled up that note and thrown it in the trash, pretended like I never saw it. Maybe then things would have turned out differently. But I didn't. Instead, I started digging. And that's when everything started to unravel. Okay, so here's the thing about digging. You never find what you're hoping for. And me? I thought I was just poking around a little. You know, asking some harmless questions, trying to get a feel for what might be going on. I wasn't expecting much. I mean, I'd been teaching for years. There's always something weird going on in high schools, gossip, rumors, kids acting out. That's what I thought this was. But after that note from Emily, well, I couldn't just ignore it. So, the next day, I went into class with a bit more awareness. You know, like I was suddenly the detective in my own mystery. I figured I'd start with the kids, just watch, listen, see if anything stood out. The first thing I noticed was how little they talked to each other. Now, this wasn't normal teenage awkwardness or the usual too cool to participate vibe. No, this was odd. Like, they weren't just quiet, they seemed nervous around one another. Like they were watching their backs, but no one was going to say why. During third period, I tried to crack a joke to break the tension. I said something stupid about Shakespeare being the original drama queen. Not my best material, but usually good for a chuckle. Nothing. Not a single kid even cracked a smile. It was like they didn't know how to react, or maybe they were afraid to. Emily was sitting near the back. She didn't look at me once, not even when I made a point of asking her a question directly. Her eyes were glued to her desk the entire time, and I swear, it was like she was waiting for something bad to happen if she made a wrong move. So, naturally, I tried to talk to her after class again. But as soon as the bell rang, she was out the door like she'd been shot from a cannon. I followed her out into the hallway, but by the time I caught up, She was already halfway to the exit. I didn't want to make a scene, so I let her go. But that only made me more curious. That's when I overheard some of the other teachers talking in the break room. I'd gone in there to grab a cup of coffee, which by the way tasted like someone had burned it 3 days earlier and then tried to resurrect it. Mrs. Lyons, the chemistry teacher, and Mr. Davison, who taught history, were sitting at the table, talking in low voices. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but, I was the new guy, and I figured I could use any information I could get. It's just not like it used to be, Mrs. Lyons was saying, shaking her head. Not since the incident. Mr. Davison nodded solemnly, like they both knew exactly what she meant. I casually walked over, pretending to look for a sugar packet that didn't exist. What incident? I asked, trying to sound like I wasn't desperate for answers. They both went silent, which in itself was weird. Lyons glanced at me, and for a second I thought she might tell me something, but then she quickly shook her head. It's nothing. Just something from a few years back. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Yeah, right? Because telling someone not to worry about something is the best way to get them to let it go, right? So, I kept my mouth shut, but my mind was already racing. What incident? What happened? And why the hell wouldn't anyone talk about it? That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden from me. So naturally, I did the most teacher nerd thing possible. I went to the school library. After hours, of course, because God forbid anyone catches me actually investigating something in a place where I'm supposed to teach. The library was your typical small-town school setup. Dusty shelves, outdated textbooks, and a librarian who looked like she could smell me coming from a mile away. But tucked in the back corner, I found an old yearbook section. I figured if anything weird had gone down, the yearbooks might give me a clue. I grabbed the one from about 5 years ago, around the time I left Willowbrook. And that's when things got really strange. Flipping through the pages, I started noticing it. Scratched out faces. Like whole pages where a handful of students' faces had been violently crossed out with black ink. Not just a single face here or there, like some dumb kid had a beef with a classmate. No, this was systematic. Someone had gone through multiple yearbooks and done this over and over again, always with the same group of students. I checked a few more yearbooks, and sure enough, same thing. About 5 or 6 kids each year. Every time. I'm not exactly an expert on school traditions, but I was pretty sure this wasn't normal. I tried asking the librarian about it, but she just gave me a blank look and muttered something about kids being kids, and don't read too much into things. The way she said it, though, gave me the creeps. Like she knew something, but didn't want to be the one to spill it. And maybe I would have let it go right then. Maybe I would have chalked it up to weird high school antics and moved on. Except the next day, Emily didn't show up to class. When I asked if anyone had seen her, all I got were blank stares and half shrugs. No one seemed surprised. No one asked where she might have gone. They acted like she'd never even existed, which, frankly, scared the hell out of me. That night, the rain was coming down even heavier than the day before. I was driving home, still thinking about Emily, when I saw her. She was walking down the side of the road in the pouring rain, no umbrella, just soaking wet. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Emily," I called out. "You okay? Do you need a ride?" She didn't answer at first, just stood there staring at me with this look that made my stomach flip. Then she walked up to the car, leaned in, and whispered, "It's in the school. It's in us." I asked her what she meant, but before I could get a real answer, she turned and ran off into the night. I sat there in my car, rain hammering down, my brain trying to process what the hell had just happened. I should have gone after her, but part of me didn't want to know what she was talking about. I wish I could say I went home and forgot about it, but how could I? A student goes missing. She tells me something's inside the school, and everyone's acting like it's business as usual. I couldn't let it go, and that was my first mistake. So there I was, stuck with this awful feeling that I was missing something huge. Emily had dropped off the map, her cryptic warning still rattling around in my brain, and the rest of the school was acting like nothing out of the ordinary had happened. I knew I had to figure it out, but where the hell do you even start when a kid tells you, "It's in the school. It's in us"? The next morning, I walked into Willowbrook High feeling like I was stepping into enemy territory. The rain had let up, but the sky was still heavy and gray, like the clouds were waiting for something. Inside the school, it was more of the same. Kids shuffling between classes, teachers chatting in the break room, everything moving along like clockwork. It all seemed so normal on the surface, but that's what made it worse. It was like the place was wearing a mask, and I was the only one who could see the cracks. I started by checking the attendance records for Emily. Nothing. Her name had been scrubbed from the system as if she had never been enrolled. It didn't make sense. I knew she existed. I saw her, talked to her, but now it was like she'd been erased from the school entirely. I asked a couple of the other teachers if they remembered her, but they just gave me these confused looks like I'd lost my mind. "She must have transferred out," one of them said with a shrug. "Kids do that all the time. Don't think too hard about it, Jack." Right? Don't think too hard about it. Like that was even an option at this point. I couldn't let it go, so I decided to dig a little deeper. After school, I went back to the library. This time, I wasn't just looking at yearbooks. I was searching for anything that could explain what the hell was going on. I found a stack of old newspapers, some local history books, even a few dusty records from the town hall archives. That's when I stumbled across a mention of the original Willowbrook Church. Now, growing up, I'd heard rumors about the church, but I figured it was just one of those creepy small-town legends, something the older kids told each other to freak people out. But as I read through the history books, I realized there was more to it. The church had burned down in the late 1800s, and most of the town's children had died in the fire. But that wasn't the weird part. No, the weird part was the pastor, Father Donovan. Apparently, old Donovan wasn't exactly a man of God in the way you'd hope. According to the records, he'd been involved in some sort of cult-like rituals. The town covered it up, of course, but the whispers persisted. They said he'd been trying to summon something dark. The fire hadn't been an accident. It had been part of a ritual. And the worst part? The church had stood right where Willowbrook High was now. I sat there, staring at the page, my hands clutching the brittle newspaper, trying to make sense of it. Could it be possible? Had something survived that fire? And if so, was it still here? I was starting to lose track of time, buried in old papers and half-forgotten stories, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Mr. Cole, the janitor, standing there, watching me with that same knowing look he'd given me before. "You're digging where you shouldn't be," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I tried to play it cool. "I'm just doing a little research, trying to get a feel for the school's history." Mr. Cole chuckled, but it wasn't a friendly sound. More like he was laughing at me for not getting it sooner. "Yeah, sure. History." He leaned in closer, his breath smelling faintly of cigarettes. "You ever wonder why people like me stick around so long? Why the teachers don't ask too many questions?" I didn't answer, mostly because I had no idea where he was going with this. "There's a reason the school runs the way it does," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "People in this town know better than to poke around. They know it's better to stay in line." I felt my throat tighten. "What do you mean by in line?" He gave me a hard look, like he was trying to decide whether or not to tell me the whole story. Then he sighed and looked down at the stack of papers I'd been reading. "You already know about the church. You know about Father Donovan. But what you don't know is what he left behind." I waited, holding my breath without even realizing it. "There's something in the school," he continued. "Something old, something angry. The town made a deal a long time ago. Keep the kids in line, keep the school running smooth, and it doesn't take too much. But when someone steps out of line, when things go wrong," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Well, that's when kids start disappearing. like Emily. I felt a chill run through me. Not the kind from the weather, but the kind you get when you realize you've stepped into something way bigger than you ever expected. "What happened to her?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Cole looked around the library like someone might be listening, then leaned in even closer. "She was supposed to be one of them. One of the special ones. But she resisted. That's why she's gone. And if you're smart, you'll stop asking questions before you're next." I stared at him, trying to wrap my head around everything he was saying. It sounded insane. Demons? Ancient pacts? It was the stuff of nightmares, not reality. But as much as I wanted to dismiss it, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was telling the truth. "There's a way to stop it," Mr. Cole said suddenly, snapping me out of my thoughts. "But it ain't easy. You gotta destroy what's binding it here." "Binding it?" I asked. "There's an altar, down in the basement, behind a door nobody's supposed to know about. It's what keeps the thing in the school, keeps it feeding. You destroy that, you break the connection." I opened my mouth to ask more, but he cut me off. "Don't ask me how I know. Just know that I've been here long enough to see what happens when someone tries to fight it." He looked at me hard. "You ain't ready for what's coming, Jack. None of us are." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, alone in the library, with more questions than answers. I didn't sleep much that night. How could I? Emily's words, Mr. Cole's warnings, and that cursed history of the school, they were all tangled up in my mind. And no matter how much I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I was imagining things, I knew one thing for sure. I had to find that altar. The next day, the school was holding a special assembly. The kind of thing that happens every year where the principal gets up and drones on about school pride and achievement. But this year felt different. There was an edge to it, something darker. And I had a feeling that whatever was about to happen had everything to do with the thing lurking beneath Willowbrook High. That's when I knew I had to stop it before it was too late. I barely slept the night before the assembly. It's one thing to hear about an ancient demon hiding in your school, but it's another thing to know that the whole town is somehow in on it, or at least keeping their mouths shut. The worst part? I didn't know who I could trust. Was Mr. Cole just messing with me? Or had he told me the truth because he wanted me to do something about it? One thing was clear, though. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to find that basement and the altar he was talking about. Whatever the passing was, it was going down today, and I had to stop it. But it's hard to stop a demon when you have no idea how to even get into the basement. The day started like any other. The kids shuffled into school, as quiet and weird as ever. The rain had finally let up, but the sky was still a dull slate gray, casting the whole place in this muted, almost dreamlike light. I went through my classes, pretending everything was normal, but in the back of my mind, I was formulating a plan. At lunchtime, I caught up with Mr. Cole in the hallway. He was pushing his cart of cleaning supplies, whistling some old tune, and pretending like we hadn't had that whole conversation about demons and altars. "Hey, Mr. Cole," I said, trying to sound casual. "That door you mentioned, how do I get down there?" He didn't even look up. "You don't want to be messing around with that, Jack. I don't have a choice." He stopped, turned to face me, and gave me this look like he was sizing me up. "You really think you can stop it?" "I have to try." He let out a long sigh, then nodded. "There's a door in the gym. It looks like it leads to a storage closet, but it doesn't. It's locked. But there's a key in the janitor's office. You get in there, you'll find the basement." I could barely believe it. The door had been right under our noses the whole time. I thanked him and started to walk away, but he grabbed my arm, his grip stronger than I expected. "Be careful," he said, his voice low. "The school's watching." I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't have to. The assembly was scheduled for that afternoon, so I had a few hours to figure things out. I couldn't exactly break into the janitor's office in broad daylight, so I had to wait until the place emptied out. In the meantime, I tried to go about my day as normally as possible, but it wasn't easy. Every time I looked at one of the students, I couldn't help but wonder if they were already part of it. Was the demon inside them already? Were they watching me the same way I was watching them? When the time came for the assembly, I made my move. While the entire school, students, teachers, everyone, was gathered in the gym, I slipped down the hallway to the janitor's office. The school felt emptier than usual, eerily quiet without the usual background noise of kids and teachers. I unlocked the door to the janitor's office with a key I'd stolen earlier from the teacher's lounge. A skill I'm not particularly proud of, but desperate times, right? And sure enough, there it was. The key Mr. Cole had mentioned, hanging on a rusty old hook. I grabbed it and made my way to the gym. The door he'd described was tucked away in a corner, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. It was labeled storage, but when I slid the key into the lock and turned it, I heard this deep, almost mechanical click, like something ancient had just been unlocked. The door swung open, revealing a dark stairwell that led down into the depths of the school. Now, I've been in my fair share of creepy places, but something about this stairwell felt wrong. The air was thick and damp, like it hadn't been breathed in years. I couldn't see the bottom, just darkness stretching out below me. Part of me wanted to turn around, close the door, and forget the whole thing. But then I thought about Emily and the other kids, and whatever the passing was. I didn't have a choice. I had to go down there. As I descended the stairs, the walls seemed to close in on me. The stone was rough and cold to the touch, like I was walking into a tomb. The smell of damp earth filled the air, and there was this faint humming sound, almost like chanting coming from somewhere deep below. Finally, I reached the bottom. The basement wasn't like anything I expected. It wasn't just some forgotten storage space or boiler room. It was a ritual space. The floor was covered in symbols, drawn in thick black lines that seemed to pulse with energy. In the center was the altar Mr. Cole had mentioned, a huge slab of stone that looked older than the school itself. It was covered in strange carvings, symbols I couldn't understand, but I didn't need to. I knew what it was for. I stood there for a second, trying to process what I was seeing, when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, expecting to see Mrs. Garber or one of the other teachers, but it wasn't them. It was the kids. A handful of students, maybe 6 or 7, standing at the top of the stairs, staring down at me. Their eyes were glassy, blank, like they weren't really there. Like they were being controlled. And then I realized they were. The demon wasn't hiding in the school, it was in the kids. It had been feeding on them, using them, turning them into its followers. And now they were here to stop me. I backed up, trying to figure out what to do when the chanting got louder. It was coming from the kids, their mouths moving in unison, their voices low and guttural. I felt this wave of cold sweep through the room, and the symbols on the floor started to glow. I knew I didn't have much time. If I didn't destroy the altar, the ritual would be complete, and the passing, whatever that was, would happen. But how the hell was I supposed to destroy a giant stone slab? Then I remembered the sledgehammer in the gym. I bolted up the stairs, pushing past the kids, who didn't even try to stop me. They just stood there, chanting, their eyes fixed on something far away, like they weren't really in control of their own bodies. I grabbed the sledgehammer from the gym and raced back to the basement. The kids were still there, chanting, their voices growing louder with each passing second. I didn't wait. I swung the hammer as hard as I could, smashing it into the altar. The stone cracked, sending shards flying across the room. I swung again and again, until the altar was nothing more than rubble. The chanting stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The air felt different, lighter, like a weight had been lifted. The kids stood there, silent, their eyes slowly returning to normal. They looked confused, scared, like they had no idea what had just happened. I didn't stick around to find out if anyone else was coming. I grabbed the hammer, made my way back up the stairs, and locked the door behind me. I didn't know if I'd stopped it for good, but at least I'd bought us some time. But when I stepped back into the gym, I saw Mrs. Garber standing there, waiting for me. She smiled, but there was something cold in her eyes. "Congratulations, Mr. Marshall," she said, her voice smooth and calm. "You've made it this far. But the school isn't done with you yet." And that's when I realized it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I stood there, gripping the sledgehammer like a lifeline, staring at Mrs. Garber. The woman who, up until that moment, had just seemed like another cranky school principal, now felt like something much worse. Her smile was tight, almost too perfect, like she'd been expecting this all along. "You've been busy," she said, casually glancing at the gym door behind me. "But you're in over your head, Jack. You don't know what you're dealing with." I didn't say anything at first. What could I say? She wasn't wrong. I destroyed the altar, but I had no idea if that was enough to stop whatever the passing was. And now, with Mrs. Garber standing in front of me like some kind of gatekeeper to hell, I wasn't sure if I'd even make it out of the school alive. "Tell me what's going on," I finally said, trying to keep my voice steady. "No more games. No more cryptic warnings. What the hell is the passing?" She chuckled softly, like I'd just asked a stupid question. "The passing isn't something you can stop. It's been happening for generations, long before you came back to Willowbrook. It's the reason this town survives, the reason it thrives." I took a step forward, my grip tightening on the hammer. "You're sacrificing the kids. We're saving the kids," she snapped, her smile disappearing. "You think Willowbrook just gets by on luck? No. The demon keeps this town alive. It protects us. In exchange, it requires nourishment. The most gifted, the brightest, they become part of it, part of something greater." I felt a wave of disgust roll through me. "Part of something greater? You're feeding them to a demon." Mrs. Garber shook her head, her face hardening. "You don't understand. Without it, the town would die. We would die. The passing ensures our survival. You think you're the first one to try to stop it? You think you're the first teacher to get in over their head? They all failed, Jack, just like you will." I wanted to argue, to scream at her, but the truth was, I didn't know what to do next. I had destroyed the altar, but I had no idea if it was enough. And Mrs. Garber was standing there, calm and collected, like she had all the power in the world. Just then, the doors to the gym burst open, and the students, those same glassy-eyed kids from the basement, filed in. They were silent, their eyes dull as they formed a perfect line behind Mrs. Garber. Like soldiers reporting for duty, Emily wasn't with them. Mrs. Garber glanced back at the students, then turned her gaze back to me. "You see? It's already too late. The passing is in motion. You can't stop it. The school is the demon, Jack. It's in the walls and the floors, in them." She gestured toward the kids. "The altar was just a formality. The real power is woven into this place. And now, it's hungry." I could feel the air shift around me. The gym lights flickered, and for the first time, I realized just how wrong everything felt. The walls seemed to pulse, like the school itself was alive, breathing. The floor under my feet vibrated ever so slightly, like something deep beneath the surface was waking up. Mrs. Garber took a step toward me, her smile returning. "You should have listened to Mr. Cole. You should have stayed in line." I glanced over at the kids. They were just standing there, blank-faced, waiting. It was like they were in a trance, and whatever was controlling them was getting stronger by the second. "I'm not gonna let you do this," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure what my next move was. She just smiled wider. "You don't have a choice." That's when I saw it. The floor beneath the students. Those same black symbols I'd seen in the basement, only now they were glowing, alive with the same malevolent energy I'd felt downstairs. The passing wasn't some distant event. It was happening right now, right in front of me, and I was the only one standing in the way. I raised the sledgehammer again, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. Mrs. Garber's eyes flicked toward the hammer, and she gave me this look, like I was a child playing with a toy. "You think that's going to help you now?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "The demon is in the school, Jack. You can't destroy what's already part of the foundation." But then I remembered what Mr. Cole had said. It wasn't just about the altar. It was about breaking the connection. The school was built on top of something ancient, something dark. The demon had been feeding for years, but it needed something, someone, to complete the ritual. And if I couldn't destroy the school, maybe I could sever its link to the kids. To Emily, that's when it hit me. The gym wasn't just a gathering place. It was the heart of the school. The place where the kids came together, where the ritual was completed. And the stage, where Mrs. Garber had been standing when she made her speeches, where the assemblies were held. That had to be where the power was strongest. I ran toward the stage, ignoring Mrs. Garber's shouts behind me. The kids didn't move. They just stood there, their faces blank, their eyes following me as I charged across the gym. I leapt onto the stage, the sledgehammer heavy in my hands, and looked around for something, anything that could break the ritual. And then I saw it. A small black stone embedded in the center of the stage floor, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. It pulsed with the same dark energy as the symbols on the floor, like a heart beating just under the surface. Without thinking, I swung the sledgehammer down with all my strength. The moment the hammer struck the stone, the entire gym seemed to tremble. A loud, almost deafening crack echoed through the room as the stone shattered into pieces. The lights above flickered wildly, and the air grew thick, like the school itself was groaning in pain. Mrs. Garber screamed, a sound so shrill and inhuman, it made my skin crawl. She stumbled back, clutching at her chest, her face twisted in agony. The kids snapped out of their trance, blinking in confusion as they looked around, disoriented. The symbols on the floor faded, the energy draining from the room like water down a drain. I jumped down from the stage, running toward the kids. "Emily," I shouted, scanning the faces, hoping, praying that she was okay. And then I saw her. She was standing near the back, her eyes wide, clearly shaken but alive. "Jack?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's over," I said, though even as I said the words, I wasn't entirely sure I believed them. Mrs. Garber was on the floor now, gasping for breath, her body twitching like something was trying to rip its way out of her. I could see the life draining from her eyes, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then her body went still, and the gym fell silent. It was done. The kids, still dazed, started to wander toward the exits, their movements slow and hesitant. Emily stayed close to me, her hand gripping mine tightly, like she was afraid to let go. I glanced back at Mrs. Garber's lifeless body one last time before we stepped out into the cold evening air. The rain had started up again, light but steady, and the clouds above the school seemed to hang lower than before. We walked in silence for a while, Emily and I. I didn't know what to say. There was no speech for this, no comforting words to make everything okay. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice small. I looked back at the school, at the dark windows and the crumbling facade. I didn't know for sure, but I had destroyed the stone, broken the connection, and stopped the passing. That had to count for something. "I think so," I said, though a part of me wasn't sure. We kept walking, the school fading into the distance behind us, the rain washing away the last remnants of the nightmare. But even as we left Willowbrook High behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That maybe, just maybe, the demon wasn't entirely gone. Because something like that, it doesn't just die, it waits, and next time it'll be ready. Alright, so this all started about a year ago. I was living with Derek at the time, my roommate. Normal guy, pretty laid back. We'd been sharing this old, kind of rundown apartment near campus for almost 2 years by then. I was working on my master's in engineering, and Derek was Derek. He worked at a bar part-time and spent the rest of his time on weird hobbies. You know, the kind of guy who's always into something new. Cryptocurrency one week, urban exploring the next. That kind of person. Anyway, it was a Thursday night, middle of the semester, so I was drowning in work, trying to get through some notes while it rained outside. Classic fall night, rain hitting the windows, all dark and dreary. I was in my room when Derek barges in, eyes wide, looking like he's seen a ghost. Now, Derek always had a flair for the dramatic, so I didn't think much of it at first. But he sits down across from me, dripping wet, still in his jacket, and says, "Dude, I think I'm possessed." I swear to you, I almost laughed. I thought he was joking, probably messed with some Ouija board or whatever with his friends. But he wasn't laughing, he was dead serious, like really freaked out. So I just said, "What the hell are you talking about, man?" He starts telling me this wild story about how he and a couple of buddies went to this abandoned asylum. Yeah, I know, it sounds like a bad horror movie already. Apparently, they were exploring the place, and Derek found some old creepy symbol carved into one of the walls. He said it felt off the second he saw it, like it was watching him. I rolled my eyes at this point, thinking, okay, here we go, Derek's latest conspiracy. But he kept going, explaining how after they left, weird things started happening. He said it started small, things moving around his room, hearing whispers when no one was there. Now, Derek was always a little out there, but he was sounding straight up paranoid this time. And here's the kicker. He thought the demon, or whatever it was after him. He said it had followed him home. That's when I stopped typing and actually listened because, well, even though it sounded ridiculous, Derek wasn't the kind of guy to act like this unless something was really up. I told him he was probably just spooked from the trip. You know, maybe his mind was playing tricks on him after wandering around a creepy building all day. But he wasn't having it. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "No, man, this is real. I feel it. It's inside me." I just sat there, unsure of what to say, when suddenly, the light in my room flickered. Just for a second, but enough for both of us to notice. And I could tell Derek saw it too because he looked at me like, "See? I'm not crazy. Now, I'm a logical guy. I don't believe in ghosts or demons or any of that stuff. I figured there was an issue with the wiring. Our apartment was a mess, after all. But a tiny part of me, a really small part, started wondering, what if Derek wasn't just being dramatic? He left my room after that, said he was going to try and sleep it off. And I went back to my work, still shaking my head at how ridiculous the whole thing was. But that night, things got weird. I was up late, trying to finish a report when I heard something, like Derek talking to himself. I figured maybe he was on his phone or watching a video, but it kept going. Quiet at first, then louder. So I got up to check on him. His door was open just a crack, and I peeked in, expecting to find him watching some dumb YouTube channel or something. Instead, I found Derek sitting on the floor, staring at the wall, muttering in a low voice. But it wasn't English. It sounded like Latin or something close. His back was to me, but the way he was sitting, it didn't seem right. I can't explain it, but he looked off, like he wasn't Derek anymore. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there for a minute, wondering if I should call out to him. Before I could decide, he suddenly stopped talking, like someone hit a switch. The room went completely silent, and for a second, it felt like the air got heavier. Then, out of nowhere, he turned his head toward the door, not his body, just his head, and looked right at me. I swear, my blood ran cold. Something about his face, his expression, it wasn't normal. His eyes looked darker, almost black, like the light didn't reach them. I didn't stick around after that. I went straight back to my room and closed the door. I tried to convince myself it was just Derek messing with me. You know, trying to freak me out because he knew I thought his whole demon thing was stupid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That was the first night I started believing that maybe, just maybe, Derek wasn't entirely wrong. I barely slept that night. I kept telling myself it was just Derek being Derek, but there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that wouldn't let me relax. By the time morning rolled around, I was a wreck, but I figured, whatever, I'll go grab some coffee, head to class, and forget the whole thing. When I got back that evening, it was raining again. Derek wasn't around, which wasn't unusual. He could be out drinking or hanging with his buddies. I went straight to my room and tried to catch up on some work, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the night before. What was he muttering? Why was he staring at the wall like that? Then around 10 p, I heard the front door open. Derek came in, soaking wet, but he didn't say anything. He just walked past my room without a word. Normally, he'd at least yell something obnoxious like, "Yo, what's up?" But tonight, dead silence. The guy didn't even glance my way. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe he was just tired or in one of his moods. But then, about an hour later, I heard it again, that same low voice coming from his room. I pressed my ear to the wall to get a better listen, definitely not English. The same weird Latin-like language from the night before. Part of me was curious, but another part was like, nope, not dealing with this again. But of course, curiosity won out. I slowly crept down the hall, trying to be as quiet as possible. His door was shut, but I could still hear him through the thin walls, muttering away. I knocked, just a little tap. "Derek?" I waited. No answer. So I knocked a little louder. "Dude, you good in there?" Still nothing. Just more muttering. I reached for the doorknob, hesitated, then opened it slowly. And there he was, sitting on the floor again, facing the same damn wall, muttering the same gibberish. This time, though, it was worse. The walls of his room were covered in symbols. Weird, jagged shapes that I'm pretty sure weren't there the day before. They looked like they'd been drawn with something dark and sticky, and the smell? It hit me like a punch in the face, metallic, almost like blood. I didn't know what to say. Derek didn't even acknowledge me. He just kept going, rocking slightly as he muttered faster and faster. I stepped closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Derek, man, what the hell is this? Did you draw this?" He finally stopped talking, but he didn't turn around. He just sat there, staring at the wall. Then, after what felt like forever, he said, in this flat, almost mechanical voice, "It's not me. It's it." I didn't even know how to respond to that. "What do you mean, it?" I asked, taking another step forward. But as soon as I did, he jumped up, fast, like way faster than he should have been able to, and spun around to face me. And I swear, for a split second, I thought I saw something behind his eyes. Something dark, moving, like a shadow crawling under his skin. "Get out," he said, his voice low and growly. "You're not safe here?" "Not safe? Derek? What are you talking about?" I was trying to stay calm, trying to rationalize this. Maybe he was having a mental breakdown. Maybe all the weird occult stuff was getting to his head. But part of me was starting to believe that there was something else going on. He took a step toward me, and instinctively I backed up. "I can't stop it," he said, his voice cracking like he was on the verge of tears. "It's gonna take me. And if you don't leave, it's going to take you too." I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there, staring at him. He was shaking, his face pale, sweat dripping down his temples, even though the room was freezing. Part of me wanted to help him, but another part of me was starting to wonder if he was beyond help. Before I could say anything, he collapsed. Just crumpled to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. I rushed over and tried to shake him awake, but he was out cold. His skin felt clammy, and there was that same weird smell in the air. I checked his pulse. He was alive, but barely. I grabbed my phone and called 911. I wasn't sure what to tell them, so I just said my roommate had passed out and wasn't responding. They sent an ambulance, and while I waited, I kept staring at those symbols on the walls. They looked ancient, evil, like something straight out of a horror movie. And the worst part? They were still wet. When the paramedics arrived, I half expected them to ask about the writing on the walls, but they didn't even look twice. They just took one glance at Derek and loaded him onto a stretcher. I followed them outside as the rain started pouring harder, soaking me to the bone as they loaded him into the ambulance. One of the paramedics asked me if I wanted to ride with them, but I shook my head. I couldn't. The whole situation felt like it was spiraling out of control, and I had no idea what to do next. Part of me wanted to just pack up and leave the apartment, but something was keeping me there. Maybe it was guilt. Derek had been my friend for 2 years after all. Or maybe it was something else, something darker, that wanted me to stay. As the ambulance pulled away, I stood there in the rain, staring after it, feeling more lost than I'd ever felt in my life. So after Derek ended up in the hospital, I thought maybe that would be the end of all this craziness. I mean, he'd get some help, maybe talk to a shrink, and that'd be that. But of course, nothing's ever that simple, right? Things got worse. A lot worse. The first night he was gone, I didn't sleep much. I couldn't stop thinking about those symbols on the walls and how Derek had looked at me like I was next on the chopping block. I kept telling myself it was just some kind of breakdown, but every time I closed my eyes, I'd see his face. Those dark, hollow eyes staring through me. The next morning, I went to the hospital to check on him. They had him sedated and under observation, and the doctors didn't have much to say. Exhaustion, they told me. Probably stress-induced psychosis. Yeah, okay, but what about the weird chanting in Latin and the demonic wall art? They brushed that off, said he'd probably just gotten into something bad, maybe drugs. The thing is, Derek wasn't into that stuff. Sure, he drank, partied, but drugs? No way. Still, I didn't push it. I figured maybe they were right, maybe all this was just some giant mental breakdown. But when I got back to the apartment, it hit me. Those symbols were still there. I couldn't leave them up. So, like an idiot, I grabbed a sponge and some cleaner and got to work. As I scrubbed, though, something weird happened. The symbols wouldn't come off, like at all. I tried every cleaning product we had, even bleach, but it was like they were part of the walls. I started getting frustrated, scrubbing harder, when all of a sudden I heard a voice behind me. "You shouldn't be doing that." I froze. The apartment was dead silent, except for the rain outside, which had started up again. Slowly I turned around. No one. I even checked the hallway. Nothing. But I know what I heard. It wasn't in my head. It was a real voice, right there in the room with me. At this point, I'm not gonna lie, I was freaked out. I stopped trying to clean the walls and decided to leave the apartment for a while, get some fresh air, clear my head. But as soon as I stepped outside, my phone rang. It was Derek. I figured maybe he was calling to apologize or explain what the hell had been going on. But when I answered, it wasn't Derek's voice. Not really. Ethan. It sounded like him, but off. Like someone was imitating his voice, only more guttural, like they had something stuck in their throat. "You need to come back." I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the rain and that creepy voice on the other end. I glanced back up at our apartment window, and in the reflection of the glass, I swear I saw a shadow move behind me. "Ethan," the voice said again, more urgent this time. "You need to come back before it's too late." I hung up. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't even go back to the hospital after that. Something about that voice and the way it felt like the air shifted around me told me this wasn't a regular Derek's losing it situation anymore. This was something else, something darker. That night, I stayed at a friend's place. I didn't tell him much, just that my roommate was going through some stuff and I needed a place to crash. I tried to relax, play some video games, watch dumb movies, anything to get my mind off it. But every now and then, I'd glance at my phone, half expecting another call. Around 3 a.m. Just when I was starting to drift off, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a call, but a text from Derek. "I can't stop it. It's taking me." I didn't reply. I didn't know how to... What do you even say to that? But what made it worse was the picture that came with the text. It was dark and grainy, but I could make out Derek's room. He was in the frame, sitting on his bed, staring into the camera. And behind him on the wall were those symbols again. Only this time they were glowing, like they were alive. I didn't go back to the apartment that night. Hell, I didn't go back for a couple of days. I just couldn't bring myself to face it. But the texts didn't stop. Every night, around the same time, Derek would send me the same message. "It's taking me." And every time, he looked worse in the photos, paler, thinner, like he hadn't eaten or slept in days. Finally, after about a week of avoiding it, I realized I had to go back. I couldn't just abandon him, right? I mean, whatever was happening to him, he was still my friend. So I got up the nerve and drove back to the apartment. It was still raining, because of course it was. By the time I parked outside, it was already dark, the kind of evening where the streetlights barely cut through the fog. I climbed the stairs, heart pounding in my chest. Okay, I know I'm not supposed to use that, but seriously, it was like a drum. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed, the symbols were gone. The walls were clean, like nothing had ever happened. "Derek?" I called out, half hoping he wouldn't answer. Silence. I walked further into the apartment, checking his room. Empty. His stuff was there, but no Derek. I started to relax, thinking maybe he'd been discharged and gone to stay with his parents or something. Maybe the doctors figured it out, maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. But then my phone buzzed again. Another text. "I'm in the basement." We didn't have a basement. At least not that I knew of. Before I could think too much about it, I heard something. A faint thudding sound, like someone was knocking, coming from the closet at the end of the hall. So there I was, standing in the hallway, staring at the closet door like it was about to open on its own. The thudding noise was faint but steady, like someone, or something, was knocking from the other side. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the pipes were acting up, or maybe it was just the wind doing something weird. But let's be real, I knew it wasn't either of those things. I hesitated, phone still in my hand, that last text from Derek staring up at me. "I'm in the basement." My brain kept screaming, "We don't have a basement," but at that moment, I had to check. I couldn't just leave it alone. So, against every ounce of common sense I had, I walked toward the closet. The closer I got, the louder the thudding became. I put my hand on the doorknob, feeling a weird kind of static in the air, like something wasn't right. I took a deep breath, turned the knob, and yanked the door open. Nothing. Just a closet filled with old coats, shoes, and some boxes. But there was one thing I hadn't noticed before. A small door at the back of the closet, almost hidden behind some of the boxes. It was one of those crawl-space doors, the kind you'd see in horror movies where you just know something terrible is behind it. I stood there for a minute, weighing my options. Part of me thought, just close the closet and pretend you didn't see it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was it. This was where all the weirdness was coming from. And if Derek's text meant anything, he was down there. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, because there was no way I was going down there without one, pushed the boxes aside, and opened the little door. It creaked like it was straight out of a horror movie, of course. Behind it, a narrow, dark staircase leading down into what looked like a basement. Now you've got to understand, I'd lived in this apartment for almost 2 years and had no idea this basement even existed. I don't know why, but something about that felt worse than anything else. With the flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other, I started down the stairs. The air got colder the further down I went, and the smell? It was like mildew and something rotten, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I kept thinking, what the hell have I gotten myself into? When I reached the bottom, the space opened up into this small, damp basement. It wasn't big, just cement walls, a low ceiling, and a dirt floor that felt soft under my shoes, like something had been digging. And there, in the corner, was Derek. Or at least, it looked like him. He was sitting on the floor, knees pulled up to his chest, staring at the wall, just like before. His skin looked even worse than in the photos, pale, almost gray, and his hair was matted like he hadn't showered in days. He didn't even react when I shined the flashlight on him. "Derek?" I said, my voice echoing off the cold walls. He didn't respond, just sat there, mumbling something under his breath. I couldn't make it out at first, so I moved closer. That's when I saw the symbols. They were all over the basement walls, just like the ones in his room. Only these were carved into the cement, deep and jagged, like someone or something had clawed them in. "Dude, we gotta get you out of here," I said, but my voice felt hollow, like the basement was swallowing up the sound. I reached out to grab him, but as soon as my hand touched his shoulder, he stopped mumbling. He turned his head, slow, like every movement was painful, and looked right at me. His eyes, they weren't Derek's eyes anymore. They were black, completely black, like a void staring back at me. And then in that same deep, guttural voice from the phone call, he said, "It's too late. It's already here." I froze, not knowing what to do. Derek, if it was still Derek, started to laugh. Not his usual laugh, but this low, rumbling sound that didn't belong in his body. The whole room seemed to pulse with it, like the walls were vibrating. I backed away, but he stood up, still grinning, and pointed to the center of the room. "You've been chosen too," he said, or more accurately, it said, "It's always been watching you." And then I saw it. At first I thought it was just a shadow in the middle of the room, but it was more than that. It moved. It shifted. This dark, shapeless thing that was somehow darker than the shadows around it. And the worst part, it felt like it was looking right at me. I don't know how to explain it, but in that moment, I realized Derek wasn't the only one it had been after. I'd been part of this from the start. Maybe Derek was just the bait, the distraction, and now whatever this thing was, it was coming for me. I backed up the stairs as fast as I could, not even bothering to close the crawlspace door behind me. The whole apartment felt wrong now, like the air had thickened, and every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps following me. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the front door into the rain. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, soaking wet, hands shaking as I fumbled to start the engine. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get out. Far away from Derek. From the apartment, from whatever was down in that basement. But as I drove away, my phone buzzed again. Another text. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. It was a picture of me standing in the basement, only I wasn't holding my phone or flashlight. I was standing in the center of the room, and that shadow, it was right behind me. And the message underneath, "We're not done yet." I didn't go back to the apartment after that. Hell, I didn't even go back to town for a while. I crashed at my parents' place in the suburbs, a good 45-minute drive away, figuring some distance would help me clear my head. But no matter where I went, I couldn't stop thinking about Derek, the symbols, the thing I saw down in that basement. It was like it had followed me somehow, even though I was miles away. Every night, I lay in bed with the rain tapping against the windows, replaying everything in my head, Derek's eyes, that laugh, the text messages. The worst part was the last photo, the one where I was standing in the basement, but I hadn't taken it, that shadow thing behind me. I couldn't get it out of my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel it, like it was waiting for me to let my guard down. After about a week of sleepless nights, I knew I had to face it. I couldn't just keep running. I couldn't let Derek go through this alone, if he was even still alive. So I decided to go back to the apartment one last time. Not to stay, but to confront whatever was happening. Either I'd help Derek, or I don't know. I just couldn't leave things the way they were. I got in my car late that evening. It was raining, of course, because apparently that's just how my life goes now. By the time I pulled up to the apartment, the sun had set, and everything was shrouded in fog, the streetlights barely cutting through it. The place looked even worse than I remembered, like the building itself had decayed in just a few days. I climbed the stairs, my stomach churning as I approached the door. I could feel that same weird energy I'd felt before, like the apartment was holding its breath. My hand shook as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Everything looked exactly the same. The furniture, the mess Derek had left, even the faint smell of mildew. But the air, it felt heavy, thick, like the walls themselves were watching me. "Derek?" I called out, half hoping he wouldn't answer. Silence, the kind that presses down on you, makes your ears ring. I moved toward his room, flashlight in hand, even though the lights were on. His door was closed, but I could hear something behind it. Not the muttering from before, this was different. It sounded like scratching. I reached for the knob and paused. Part of me wanted to turn around, walk out, and never look back. But I couldn't. I needed to know. I opened the door. Derek was sitting on the floor, facing the wall again, just like the last time. His nails were digging into the wall, scraping away at the paint, blood smeared where he'd scratched too deep. The symbols were back, but this time they were all over. On the floor, the ceiling, even on Derek's skin. He was covered in them, drawn in black ink or something darker. "Derek," I said softly, stepping into the room, "you have to stop." He didn't respond, just kept scratching, his head twitching slightly, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. And then, just like before, he stopped. Slowly, he turned to face me, his eyes, those black, empty eyes, locking onto mine. "It's here," he whispered, his voice barely human. "It's been waiting for you." I backed up a lot, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the room. The temperature dropped instantly, and that same smell, like something rotten, filled the air. Suddenly, Derek stood up, too fast, like his joints were bending in the wrong direction. "It wants you," he growled, stepping toward me. "It's always wanted you." And that's when I realized, all this time, it wasn't Derek the demon was after. It was me. It had been watching me, manipulating me through Derek, using him to weaken me, to lure me back here. And now it was time to finish the job. The shadow from the basement appeared behind him, dark and shapeless, but somehow alive, twisting and writhing like it was made of pure darkness. I could feel it pulling at me, tugging at the edges of my mind, trying to break me down. But something in me snapped. I wasn't going to let this thing win. Not like this. I lunged for the flashlight, the only thing I had, and swung it as hard as I could at Derek. It connected with a sickening crack, and he crumpled to the floor, unconscious. But the shadow, it didn't stop. It started moving toward me, slow at first, but then faster, like it could sense my fear. I did the only thing I could think of. I started shouting at it. "You can't have me," I screamed, backing into the corner of the room. "I'm not yours." The shadow hesitated for a moment, like it was confused. And in that moment, I saw it. Derek's body twitching on the floor, his eyes flickering between black and normal, like he was fighting whatever was inside him. "Ethan?" Derek's voice, his real voice, came through for the first time in days. "Help me." I don't know why I did it, but I dropped the flashlight, grabbed him by the shoulders, and started shaking him. "Fight it, Derek. Don't let it take you." For a second, everything froze. The shadow stopped moving. Derek's body went limp, and the room felt still. I thought maybe I'd won, maybe I'd done something right. But then Derek's eyes snapped open, blacker than ever, and the shadow surged forward, engulfing him completely. I stumbled back, watching as Derek's body twisted and contorted, the symbols glowing brighter and brighter. The shadow seemed to sink into him, like it was absorbing into his skin. And then, with a final guttural scream, Derek collapsed. The room went silent. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The shadow was gone. The symbols faded. And Derek, he was just lying there, unmoving. I crouched down, my heart racing, and checked his pulse. Nothing. He was gone. I don't know how long I stayed there, but eventually I got up, left the apartment, and called the police. I told them Derek had been sick for a while, that he'd been acting strange, and that I found him dead when I got home. They didn't ask too many questions. Maybe they could tell I wasn't ready to answer them anyway. Now, months later, I still don't know exactly what happened in that apartment. Part of me thinks Derek was right, that something evil had been living there, waiting for its chance. Waiting for me. And maybe, just maybe, it's still out there. Watching. Waiting for the next person to find it. Because sometimes when I'm alone, I still get texts from Derek's number. Texts that say, "I'm not done with you yet." Thank you for joining me here in the shadows. I hope tonight's scary stories helped you relax and unwind. For the next 30 minutes, the sound of rain will fill the silence, letting you drift deeper into sleep. If you're still awake, feel free to explore more scary stories on the channel. No rush, stay as long as you like. Remember, there's always more waiting for you in the dark corners of the night. Good night, and sleep well.